At the end of the Ice Age, nothing in the human body suddenly broke, and no single moment marked a loss. Yet something quiet began to shift as the world grew warmer and more stable. The same body that had endured cold, scarcity, and constant movement no longer faced those exact pressures, and without them, its strength began to change in ways that are easy to overlook. Not weaker in a simple sense, but no longer shaped by the same demands that once defined every step, every grip, every effort to stay alive. If strength was once a direct response to a harsher world, then what happens to it when that world slowly disappears? And why did humans lose strength after the Ice Age? There is a quiet tendency to think of strength as something a body either has or does not have, as if it were a fixed trait that could be measured the same way across all times. But when we move back toward the earliest conditions of human life, especially during the long span of the Ice Age, that idea begins to feel less stable. Strength did not exist as a stable quality waiting to be used. It was something that emerged, moment by moment, from the demands placed on the body by its surroundings. Without those demands, the shape and function of strength would not have taken the same form at all. The human body was not designed in advance for endurance or power. It was continuously shaped by the pressures it could not avoid. In the cold landscapes that dominated much of the Ice Age, survival required constant interaction with the environment. Movement was not optional, and stillness often came with a cost. The body responded accordingly, not by becoming uniformly stronger in every sense, but by adapting to repeated patterns of effort that were tied directly to survival. Carrying, walking, lifting, enduring cold, and recovering with limited energy were not separate activities. They formed a continuous loop that shaped how muscles, joints, and even posture developed over time. Strength in this context was not an abstract capacity. It was the visible result of a body that had no choice but to respond. When we look at the present, the contrast can appear subtle at first. The same human structure remains, with the same bones and muscles arranged in familiar ways. Yet the relationship between the body and its environment has shifted. The pressures that once required constant physical response are no longer present in the same form. This does not mean that strength disappeared, but it changes how and when it emerges. A body that is not required to respond in the same way will not maintain the same patterns of adaptation. Over time, this leads to differences that are not always obvious in a single moment, but become clearer when viewed across longer periods. It becomes less useful to ask whether humans simply became weaker after the Ice Age. A more careful question begins to form when we consider how strength was originally created. If it was not an inherent trait, but a response to continuous demand, then any change in that demand would reshape the outcome. The end of the Ice Age did not remove strength from the human body. Instead, it altered the conditions that had been constantly calling it into existence. The body, as it always does, followed those conditions. In earlier environments, the margin between effort and failure was often narrow. A task left incomplete or a movement avoided could carry direct consequences. This did not make every individual stronger in a uniform way, but it ensured that physical response remained closely tied to daily life. There was little separation between survival and movement. Each reinforced the other. Over time, this created a form of strength that was integrated into ordinary existence, rather than isolated as a distinct activity. When the climate began to stabilize and ecosystems shifted, that constant pressure eased, even if only gradually. The body no longer faced the same uninterrupted sequence of demands. It still moved, still carried, still adapted, but the intensity and continuity of those requirements changed. As a result, the expression of strength began to shift as well. It did not vanish, but it no longer needed to be present in the same persistent way. This is where the quiet nature of the change becomes important. There is no clear boundary where strength is lost. Instead, there is a gradual adjustment in how often it is required, how broadly it is used, and how deeply it is embedded in everyday life. The Ice Age did not create strong humans in a simple sense. It created conditions that required constant physical response, and from those conditions, a particular form of strength emerged. When those conditions faded, the response changed with them. The body did not resist this shift, because it had never been fixed in the first place. It had always been a reflection of what it needed to do in order to continue. This leads to a more careful way of thinking about what was lost. Not a sudden reduction in ability, but a gradual loosening of the link between survival and physical demand. When that link weakens, the body reorganizes itself around a different set of priorities. Strength becomes less constant, less embedded, and more situational. It is still present, but it is no longer the same kind of presence that once defined the human experience in colder and more demanding worlds. The change begins not in the muscles themselves, but in the relationship between the body and the environment that shapes them over time. As that relationship shifts, so does everything that grows from it. And without the continuous need that once called strength into being, the body slowly learns a different way to exist, one that carries a quieter form of effort and a different balance between movement and rest. The question then becomes less about what disappeared and more about what no longer needs to be sustained in the same way, as the memory of those earlier conditions continues to fade within the structure of the human body. If strength is understood as a response rather than a fixed trait, then the next layer becomes easier to notice, not in sudden changes but in repetition. During the Ice Age, the human body was not exposed to extreme effort once in a while, but to moderate and necessary effort almost all the time. This difference matters more than it first appears. A single moment of intense exertion can build capacity, but it is the steady, repeated demand that shapes how the body organizes itself over long periods. The landscapes of that time did not allow long stretches of inactivity without consequence. Movement filled the day in small, continuous segments, each one tied to finding food, maintaining warmth, or navigating terrain that offered no shortcuts. Over time, this created a pattern where the body remained in a state of low but constant engagement, rather than alternating sharply between effort and rest. Muscles, joints, and connective tissues adapted not just to force but to duration and frequency. Strength, in this sense, was not something that appeared only when needed. It was something that remained quietly active beneath every action. When we observe the human body now, the structure is still capable of responding to physical demand, but the pattern of that demand has changed. Effort is often separated from necessity. Movement can be postponed, replaced, or minimized without immediate consequence. The body still retains the capacity to become strong, but it is no longer guided by the same continuous signals that once shaped it. This separation creates a different relationship between the body and its own abilities. Instead of being constantly reinforced through daily survival, strength becomes something that must be deliberately activated. Without that activation, the body gradually adjusts to a lower baseline of physical requirement. This does not mean that modern humans are incapable of strength, but it does suggest that the conditions that once maintained it are no longer present in the same way. Looking back toward the Ice Age, it becomes clear that strength was not built through isolated acts of effort, but through the absence of prolonged inactivity. The body was rarely at complete rest during waking hours. Even when not moving across large distances, small adjustments, shifts in posture, and interactions with the environment kept the body engaged. These subtle movements accumulated over time, reinforcing a level of physical readiness that did not need to be consciously maintained. In contrast, when periods of stillness become longer and more frequent, the body begins to reorganize around that stillness. Muscles are used less often, joints experience narrower ranges of motion, and the signals that once maintained constant engagement become less frequent. The result is not an immediate loss, but a gradual change in how the body distributes its resources. Energy is conserved differently, effort is reserved for specific moments, and the background presence of strength becomes less pronounced. This shift can be understood without assuming any sudden decline. The human body remains responsive, but it follows the patterns it is given. During the Ice Age, those patterns were shaped by environments that demanded continuous adaptation. Every step, every adjustment to cold, every interaction with uneven ground reinforced a system that favored endurance through repetition. As those conditions changed, the repetition changed as well. Over generations, this altered how strength was expressed, not by removing it, but by changing how often it was required to be present. Archaeological evidence supports this gradual transition. Skeletal remains from earlier periods often show signs of consistent physical use, with markers that suggest regular loading of the body through movement and labor. Later remains, from more stable and settled environments, sometimes reflect different patterns of use. indicating a shift in how the body was engaged over time. These differences are not absolute, but they point toward a broader trend in how human activity changed alongside environmental conditions. The key point is not that one period produced stronger humans in every sense, but that the relationship between effort and survival was more tightly connected. When that connection loosens even slightly, the body begins to follow a different path. Strength becomes less embedded in daily life and more dependent on specific situations. It is still available, but it is no longer constantly reinforced by the structure of the environment itself. This makes the change difficult to notice from one moment to the next. There is no clear point where the body crosses from one state to another. Instead, there is a slow adjustment, guided by the absence of continuous demand. The Ice Age did not create strength through intensity alone, but through persistence. When that persistence fades, the body does not lose its ability, but it no longer organizes itself around maintaining it at all times. In this way, strength becomes something that can be gained and lost within a lifetime, rather than something that is quietly sustained by the conditions of existence. The deeper question begins to form again, not about whether humans became weaker, but about how the rhythm of daily life shifted away from constant physical engagement, and how that shift continues to shape the body in ways that are easy to overlook when viewed only in the present moment. There is one more layer that makes the idea of strength during the Ice Age feel different from how it is often imagined today, and it lies in how closely the body was tied to consequence. Strength was not maintained for its own sake, and it was not something stored away for future use. It existed within a narrow window where each movement carried a direct relationship to what happened next. A grip that failed, a step that faltered, or a delay in response could matter in ways that are difficult to fully reconstruct from a distance. This does not suggest constant danger in every moment, but it does point to a world where the body could not afford long disconnection from its own physical capacity. In that context, strength was not only shaped by repetition, but by the quiet presence of consequence that surrounded ordinary actions. The environment did not need to impose extreme events to influence the body. It only needed to remain consistent in requiring response. Over time, this created a kind of alignment between perception and movement. The body learned to remain ready, not in a tense or heightened way, but in a steady and continuous state of engagement. Muscles were not waiting to be activated. They were part of an ongoing process that linked attention, balance, and effort into a single flow. This is different from a body that can separate awareness from action, where long periods pass without the need to respond physically to the surrounding space. During the Ice Age, the landscape itself encouraged this connection. Uneven ground, shifting surfaces, and the constant need to adjust to temperature and terrain required subtle, frequent corrections. These corrections did not appear as moments of strength in the usual sense, but they contributed to a broader pattern of use that shaped the body over time. Strength, in this setting, was not defined by isolated acts of lifting or force, but by the ability to remain continuously responsive without interruption. When the Ice Age came to an end and environments became more stable, that relationship began to change. The link between movement and immediate consequence softened. Tasks could be delayed, effort could be distributed differently, and the body no longer needed to remain in the same constant state of readiness. This did not remove physical demand entirely, but it introduced gaps where the body could disengage without immediate cost. Over time, those gaps became part of the new pattern. The body, as it always does, adapted to what it encountered most often. When continuous engagement was no longer required, it no longer maintained it in the same way. This shift is not best understood as a loss, but as a reorganization. The same biological structure adjusted to a different rhythm of use. Strength became more conditional, appearing when called upon, rather than being quietly sustained at all times. This distinction can be difficult to notice because the body still functions, still moves, and still retains the ability to respond when needed. But the underlying pattern has changed. The constant background presence of physical readiness, shaped by a world that required it, has been replaced by a more intermittent pattern of activation. Archaeological findings provide subtle support for this idea. Earlier human remains often show signs of habitual loading and adaptation across the entire body, suggesting frequent and varied use. Later populations, especially those associated with more settled ways of living, sometimes display different patterns, with evidence pointing toward more localized or repetitive forms of activity. These differences do not indicate a simple decline, but they reflect a shift in how the body interacted with its environment over time. The Ice Age did not produce stronger individuals in every sense, but it maintained a closer alignment between the body and the conditions that required it to respond. When that alignment loosened, the nature of strength changed with it. The body no longer needed to sustain the same continuous level of readiness, and so it gradually adjusted to a different balance between effort and rest. What remains is not a weaker body, but a body shaped by a different set of expectations. The quiet influence of consequences faded, and with it, the need for strength to be constantly present beneath every movement. This leads back to the central question from a different angle. If strength once existed as a continuous response to a demanding world, then its transformation after the Ice Age may say less about what was lost, and more about what the body no longer needs to carry in the same way. The change is not marked by a single event, but by a gradual shift in the relationship between the body and the environment it moves through. And within that shift, something subtle has been left behind, not removed, but no longer required to remain as it once was. When we look more closely at the Ice Age environment, it becomes clear that strength did not arise from isolated challenges, but from a landscape that applied pressure in every direction at once. Cold was not simply a background condition. It shaped how the body used energy, how it moved, and how long it could remain exposed without consequence. The temperature alone influenced muscle function, requiring the body to generate heat through movement rather than rely on stillness. In such conditions, remaining inactive for too long was not neutral. It could gradually reduce the body's ability to maintain warmth, which in turn created a subtle but constant incentive to keep moving. This does not mean that every moment was spent in visible exertion, but it does suggest that inactivity carried a different weight than it does in more stable climates. The environment itself encouraged a continuous exchange between effort and survival. Beyond temperature, the availability of food added another layer of pressure. Resources were not evenly distributed, and they did not remain in one place for long. Finding food required movement across large areas, often without certainty of success. This created a pattern where effort had to be sustained even without immediate reward. The body adapted to this uncertainty by maintaining a capacity for repeated movement rather than short bursts of isolated action. Walking, tracking, carrying, and returning formed cycles that could not be easily avoided. Over time, these cycles shaped how strength was expressed, not as a peak ability, but as a steady readiness to continue. The terrain itself reinforced this pattern. Ice Age landscapes were often uneven, with surfaces that shifted underfoot, from frozen ground to loose sediment and seasonal changes that altered familiar paths. Navigating such terrain required constant adjustment, engaging muscles not only for force but for balance and coordination. These adjustments were small in each moment, but they accumulated across the day, creating a continuous demand on the body. Strength, in this context, was not only about lifting or carrying, it was also about maintaining stability in an environment that did not offer predictable support. This type of engagement is easy to overlook because it does not appear as a single measurable action, yet it plays a significant role in shaping how the body develops over time. Wind, precipitation, and changing seasons added further variability. The body could not rely on a fixed set of conditions. It had to remain adaptable, ready to respond to shifts that could alter movement patterns and energy use from one day to the next. This variability prevented the body from settling into a narrow range of activity. Instead, it encouraged a broader range of physical responses, each reinforcing different aspects of strength. Carrying objects over distance, adjusting posture against wind, or conserving energy during colder periods, all contributed to a system where strength was distributed across many functions rather than concentrated in a single form. When these environmental pressures are considered together, a clearer picture begins to form. The Ice Age did not impose one type of challenge, but a combination of factors that interacted with each other. Cold influenced energy use, scarce food required movement, and uneven terrain demanded constant adjustment. None of these alone would fully explain the development of strength, but together they created a setting where the body was rarely free from physical demand. This continuous exposure shaped not only muscles and bones, but also how the body regulated effort over time. Energy had to be managed carefully, balancing immediate needs with the uncertainty of what might come next. Strength, therefore, was not separate from endurance or efficiency. It was part of a larger system that allowed the body to function within an environment that offered little stability. As the Ice Age came to an end, these overlapping pressures began to shift. Temperatures became more moderate, ecosystems changed, and the distribution of resources became more predictable in certain regions. The landscape did not become easy, but it became different in ways that reduced the need for constant physical response. Movement was still necessary, but it was not always driven by the same level of urgency or uncertainty. The body, in turn, adjusted to these new conditions. The constant background pressure that once shaped strength began to ease, allowing other patterns of behavior to emerge. This transition did not occur all at once, and it did not affect all populations in the same way. However, over long periods, it altered the relationship between the body and its environment. Strength remained a capacity, but it was no longer reinforced by the same continuous set of demands. Instead, it became one of many possible responses, rather than a constant requirement embedded in daily life. The Ice Age environment, with its combination of cold, scarcity, and variability, had quietly sustained a form of strength that was deeply integrated into how humans moved and survived. When that environment changed, the body followed, not by losing its ability, but by reorganizing how often that ability needed to be expressed. The pressure of the Ice Age was not only harsh because it was cold, it was harsh because the body could not deal with any one challenge in isolation. Cold was tied to hunger. Hunger was tied to distance. Distance was tied to terrain, and terrain was tied to how much energy remained at the end of the day. This made the environment more than a backdrop. It became an active force that shaped the body through accumulation. A person moving through a cold landscape with uncertain food and no reliable shelter was not simply facing several separate problems. The body had to solve them all at once, often with limited recovery and no guarantee that tomorrow would be easier. Under those conditions, strength was never just about force. It had to work together with balance, stamina, coordination, and the ability to continue after fatigue had already begun. That is one reason the Ice Age body cannot be understood through modern images of strength alone. It was not a body built for display or for short, isolated effort. It was a body under pressure from many directions at the same time. Cold changed how quickly energy was used, especially when people remained exposed for long periods. The body had to protect heat without wasting too much fuel. This often meant movement became part of temperature regulation. Hunger made that problem harder, because the same body that needed energy to stay warm also needed energy to search, carry, process, and return. Nothing in that cycle was efficient in the modern sense. The landscape itself increased the cost. Walking across uneven ground, frozen surfaces, wet soil, or shifting seasonal terrain demanded more from the hips, ankles, spine, and feet than smooth and stable ground does today. Even when the pace was not fast, the effort was distributed across the whole body. Each day could become a long negotiation between what the environment demanded and what the body still had available. That kind of life does not only produce moments of exertion, it creates a long, physical conversation between the world and the body. Archaeology and biological anthropology do not give us a perfect picture of daily experience, but they do suggest that earlier human populations often lived with high levels of routine physical demand. Skeletal evidence from many prehistoric populations shows patterns consistent with frequent loading, repeated movement, and sustained use of the body over time. Bones respond to stress gradually. They are not only passive structures, they remodel in relation to how they are used. That means the traces left in ancient skeletons are important, not because they tell us everything, but because they show that the human body was often living inside conditions of repeated physical requirement. This matters for the title's question because it shifts the story away from a simple idea of human decline. The Ice Age did not create stronger humans by magic, and its ending did not suddenly weaken them. What changed was the total pressure of the environment. During colder periods, many bodies had to remain physically engaged just to remain functional inside the world around them. Later, as climates warmed and some regions became more stable, the body no longer faced the same uninterrupted chain of demands. It still worked, adapted, and carried loads, but the background intensity of everyday life could soften. The difference may have begun not in spectacular changes, but in reduced frequency, fewer long movements, more predictability, slightly less exposure, slightly narrower ranges of effort. Over generations, those small changes matter. Another important point is that Ice Age strength was probably uneven, not uniform. Different regions, seasons, and populations would have placed different demands on the body. The point is not that all humans living near the end of the Ice Age were equally strong in the same way. The point is that the environment itself kept physical demand close to daily survival. That link is the real subject here. Once survival no longer required the same amount of full-body negotiation with cold, distance, instability, and uncertainty, the body did what it has always done. It adjusted. It stopped maintaining what no longer had to be maintained at the same level. So when we ask why humans lost strength after the Ice Age, the most careful answer may begin here. They did not first lose strength inside the muscles. They first lost part of the world that had been asking for it every day. And when that world slowly changed, the body, still deeply responsive, began to change with it in quieter ways than a single lifetime could easily see. What becomes clearer when we stay with this environment a little longer is that the Ice Age did not only demand effort from the body, it limited the ways the body could avoid that effort. In more stable conditions, it is often possible to delay movement, to choose when to act, or to conserve energy by remaining still for longer periods. During much of the Ice Age, those options were narrower, not entirely absent, but constrained by conditions that did not allow long separation between need and response. This constraint shaped how strength was maintained, not through conscious effort, but through the absence of alternatives. The body could not easily choose inactivity without accepting a cost that would accumulate over time. This made strength less of a decision and more of a condition of existence. The connection between movement and outcome remained close, even when the actions themselves appeared small. A short walk could extend into a longer search, a change in weather could require adjustment in direction, and a delay could reduce the chances of success later in the day. None of these events needed to be dramatic to matter. They only needed to repeat often enough to create a pattern where the body stayed engaged because disengagement carried consequences. This pattern did not produce constant strain in the sense of exhaustion at every moment. Instead, it created a steady baseline where the body remained prepared to respond without interruption. Strength, in this sense, was not something that appeared at the peak of effort, but something that was distributed across the entire day. When the Ice Age came to an end, that limitation began to loosen. The environment did not become easy, but it became more predictable in many regions. Food sources could be found with less uncertainty, seasonal changes became less extreme, and the need to respond immediately to every shift in the environment reduced, even if only slightly. This created new possibilities for spacing out effort, for allowing longer periods of reduced activity without the same immediate cost. Over time, this altered the rhythm of daily life. Movement could still be demanding, but it was no longer required to be continuous in the same way. The body, as always, adapted to this new rhythm. It began to experience more variation between periods of activity and periods of rest. This variation is important because it changes how strength is maintained. Instead of being reinforced constantly, it becomes something that rises and falls depending on how often it is used. The background presence of strength becomes less stable, not because the body has lost its capacity, but because it is no longer being asked to sustain that capacity without interruption. Archaeological records, while incomplete, suggest that as human groups moved toward more stable environments and eventually toward early forms of settlement, patterns of activity became more localized. This does not mean that life became inactive, but it does indicate a shift in how effort was distributed. Repetition remained, but it often focused on narrower ranges of motion or specific tasks. Over generations, this could influence how the body developed, leading to differences in how strength was expressed across different populations and time periods. The Ice Age environment had once limited the body's ability to reduce effort, keeping strength closely tied to daily survival. As that limitation eased, the body gained flexibility in how it used and conserved energy. This flexibility allowed for new behaviors, new forms of organization, and eventually new ways of living. but it also meant that strength no longer needed to be present at the same constant level. It could become situational, emerging when required and fading when not. This shift is subtle because it does not appear as a clear loss. It appears as a change in how often strength is visible. In a world where continuous engagement is no longer required, the body reorganizes around efficiency rather than persistence. Effort becomes something that can be scheduled, delayed, or reduced without immediate consequence. Over long periods, this changes the baseline from which the body operates. The question of why humans lost strength after the Ice Age begins to take on a different meaning here. It is not only about what the environment demanded, but about what it allowed the body to avoid. When the world no longer closes the gap between need and action, the body no longer has to maintain the same uninterrupted level of readiness. Strength does not disappear, but it is no longer woven into every moment in the same way. And as that quiet shift continues across generations, the body carries forward a different pattern, one shaped not by constant pressure, but by the growing space between effort and necessity. One of the easiest mistakes to make when thinking about human strength in the distant past is to imagine that people became strong because they were deliberately training their bodies, as if Ice Age life were filled with something like exercise before exercise had a name. But that way of seeing the past quietly places a modern idea into a very different world. Movement during the Ice Age was not a separate category of life. It was not scheduled, optimized, or chosen for improvement. It was woven into the basic structure of survival so completely that the body did not need a special reason to move. It moved because food was not nearby, because shelter was not guaranteed, because warmth could not always be preserved without effort, and because distance stood between the body and what it needed. This matters because a body shaped by necessity is not quite the same as a body shaped by intentional training. Training usually has edges. It begins, it ends, and it often targets one ability at a time. Survival movement is less clean. It blends walking, carrying, bending, climbing, balancing, lifting, waiting, and starting again. Its intensity may vary, but its presence is constant. That difference helps explain why strength during the Ice Age was likely embedded so deeply in ordinary life. It was not being built in isolated moments. It was being maintained through the continuous use of the whole body across many kinds of tasks. A person moving through a cold and uncertain landscape was not trying to become stronger. The body was simply responding to repeated demands that could not be postponed forever. That kind of movement creates a different relationship between effort and identity. In modern life, strength can feel like an addition, something a person acquires on top of ordinary living. In Ice Age conditions, physical capacity was more tightly bound to ordinary living itself. The line between action and survival was thin. Walking long distances was not cardio. Carrying materials was not resistance work. Holding balance on unstable ground was not mobility practice. Yet all of these would have placed repeated demands on muscle, bone, posture, and coordination. The important point is not that every Ice Age human was exceptionally strong by modern standards. It is that the body had fewer chances to separate daily life from physical requirement. That separation, which is common now, changes everything. When effort becomes optional, strength becomes conditional. When effort is built into survival, strength becomes background. It is sustained quietly, often without conscious attention. This is also where the title's question begins to deepen. If humans lost strength after the Ice Age, that loss may have started not when muscles became smaller or work became easier, but when movement itself stopped being unavoidable in the same way. Once the body no longer had to solve daily survival through constant physical response, the meaning of movement changed. It could still be hard, but it became easier to divide life into active moments and inactive ones. That division matters because the human body adapts very closely to frequency. A task done rarely can still be demanding, but it does not shape the body the same way as moderate effort repeated all through the week, all through the season, all through a lifetime. Archaeological and anthropological evidence supports the broader idea that many prehistoric populations lived with high levels of habitual physical activity. Skeletal remains often preserve signs of repeated loading and regular use, suggesting that movement was not occasional or specialized, but routine and deeply integrated into life. We should be careful not to exaggerate this or turn it into a romantic myth. Prehistoric life was not a perfect system for building strength, and it varied greatly across time and place. But the overall pattern still points towards something important. Human bodies were being shaped by repeated necessity rather than selective training. And when climates warmed, landscapes changed, and eventually more stable forms of living became possible, the body entered a different relationship with movement. It did not stop moving. It stopped needing to move in quite the same uninterrupted way. That is the quiet transition at the center of this story. During the Ice Age, movement was not exercise. It was the body answering the world over and over again. And once the world began asking different questions, the body, still responsive as ever, began giving different answers. What made movement during the Ice Age so powerful in shaping the human body was not only that it happened often, but that it almost never arrived in pure form. A modern person can choose to separate walking from lifting, balance from endurance, or strength from skill. The body can be trained in pieces. But in a colder and less predictable world, movement rarely appeared one piece at a time. A person might walk for a long distance, then carry something uneven, then crouch, then rise, then shift direction, then stabilize on uncertain ground, all while managing cold, fatigue, and limited energy. The body was not solving one problem. It was solving many at once through movement. That created a very different physical pattern from deliberate training. Instead of repeating one controlled action in a protected setting, the body had to coordinate multiple systems together in real conditions, where no movement was fully isolated from the rest. This matters because strength built inside that kind of life was not narrow. It was spread across the body through constant variation. The hands, shoulders, spine, hips, knees, and feet were not being used one after another in clean sequence. They were participating together in a single stream of action. Even ordinary tasks would have asked for combinations of grip, posture, balance, and force. Over time, this kind of whole-body use likely helped maintain a level of physical integration that is harder to sustain when movement becomes more specialized or optional. The body did not need to remember to train stability, because stability was already present in the act of moving through the world. It did not need separate moments for endurance, because endurance was folded into the length and repetition of everyday effort. This is one reason the end of the Ice Age may have mattered more than it first seems. When environments become more stable, movement often becomes less entangled. Tasks can become shorter, more predictable, and more narrowly focused. The body may still work hard, but not always in the same combined way. Once daily life no longer forces so many forms of effort to overlap, the body no longer has to maintain them as one continuous system. Strength can remain, but it starts to become more fragmented. A person may still carry, still walk, still bend, still work, yet the body is no longer being shaped by the same uninterrupted blend of demands that once came from cold landscapes, uneven ground, uncertain distance, and the simple need to continue. This transition helps explain why it is misleading to imagine that humans after the Ice Age merely stopped being strong. What changed was the structure of movement itself. The body was no longer being asked to combine so many physical responses so often. That does not reduce human ability to a simple decline. It suggests a change in pattern. And pattern matters because the human body adapts less to isolated events than to repeated forms of life. Skeletal evidence from prehistoric populations often points toward regular, habitual loading across the body, not only in one region or one kind of task. While we must be careful not to oversimplify or pretend all ancient people moved the same way, the broader picture still supports the idea that daily activity was often more varied, more constant, and more physically integrated than in many later settings. During the Ice Age, movement was not cleanly divided into categories. It was a woven response to a world that kept changing under the feet, across the seasons and within the body itself. That is why calling it exercise misses something important. Exercise is usually chosen. It is often bounded by time, space, and intention. Ice Age movement was shaped by necessity, uncertainty, and continuation. It did not need to feel dramatic to transform the body. It only needed to happen again tomorrow, and again after that, until strength was no longer a separate quality, but part of the body's ordinary way of meeting the world. When that world changed, and movement slowly became less mixed, less unavoidable, and less constant, the body began to reorganize around a different rhythm. The loss, if we call it that, may have begun not with weaker muscles, but with the gradual disappearance of a life in which nearly every movement trained the whole body without ever being called training. There is a final detail in this pattern of movement that is easy to miss because it does not appear in any single action. It lies in how the body learned to move without interruption, not only across the day, but across long stretches of time, where no clear boundary separated one effort from the next. During the Ice Age, movement did not need to be intense to be meaningful. What mattered was that it continued. A person could walk, pause briefly, adjust position, continue again, carry something for a while, set it down, then move on. Each action might seem small, but together they formed a continuous chain. The body did not reset between these moments. It remained engaged, shifting from one demand to another without fully returning to a state of complete rest. This kind of continuity creates a different relationship with fatigue. Instead of building toward a single peak of exhaustion followed by full recovery, the body operates within a range where effort rises and falls without ever disappearing entirely. Muscles remain active at low levels, joints stay within regular ranges of motion, and the system as a whole maintains a steady rhythm. Over time, this teaches the body to distribute effort rather than concentrate it. Strength, in this setting, is not something that appears only at maximum force. It is present in the ability to keep going, to adjust, to remain stable even when energy is not at its highest point. This is closely tied to how early humans moved through space. Distance was rarely a single event. It was something that unfolded gradually, often across uneven terrain and changing conditions. The body had to manage energy carefully, avoiding sudden peaks of effort that could not be sustained. This encouraged a style of movement that was efficient, steady, and adaptable. Strength was part of that efficiency, not separate from it. It supported the ability to continue rather than the ability to perform isolated feats. When environments became more stable after the Ice Age, the structure of daily movement began to change. Tasks could be more clearly defined, with more distinct beginnings and endings. A person might work, then stop, then rest, then begin again later. These separations introduce clearer cycles of effort and recovery. While this can be beneficial in many ways, it also changes how the body organizes its resources. Instead of maintaining a continuous baseline of activity, the body begins to alternate more sharply between use and non-use. During periods of rest, muscles are less engaged, joints move less, and the signals that maintain constant readiness become less frequent. Over time, this can lead to a different expression of strength. It becomes more dependent on specific moments of activation rather than being sustained quietly in the background. The body is still capable, but it is no longer organized around continuous use. This shift is subtle, and it does not happen all at once. It unfolds across generations as patterns of life change. The Ice Age did not end in a single moment everywhere, and human responses to environmental change were varied and gradual. But across long periods, the general trend moves toward greater separation between effort and rest. That separation alters the rhythm that once supported a constant presence of strength. Archaeological evidence again offers indirect support. Patterns in skeletal remains suggest that earlier populations often experienced repeated varied loading, while later groups sometimes show signs of more localized or repetitive activity. These patterns do not tell us everything about daily life, but they point toward changes in how the body was used over time. They reflect a shift from continuous, varied engagement toward more segmented forms of activity. This is not a loss in a simple sense. It is a reorganization. The body adapts to what it experiences most often. When movement becomes more continuous, strength becomes part of that continuity. When movement becomes more segmented, strength becomes more episodic. It appears when needed and recedes when not. The deeper question returns again, not as a statement, but as a quiet observation. If strength during the Ice Age was supported by a life where movement rarely stopped completely, then what happens when that continuity fades and the body begins to live within clearer boundaries between action and rest, carrying forward a different rhythm that no longer requires strength to be present in every moment in the same way? A body that can endure cold is not simply a stronger version of a body that lives in comfort. It is, in some important ways, a differently organized body, shaped by pressures that reach into metabolism, circulation, movement, recovery, and even the timing of effort itself. During the Ice Age, cold did not act only from the outside. It changed what the body had to do from within. Heat had to be preserved, energy had to be managed carefully, and long exposure to wind, low temperatures, and uncertain shelter meant that physical effort often served more than one purpose at once. Movement could help generate warmth, posture could reduce exposure, and carrying or walking was never only about distance. It was also part of staying functional in an environment that could steadily drain the body if it remained too passive for too long. This is why the cold matters so much to the question of strength. A body living under regular cold stress may not become stronger in every sense, but it is more likely to maintain a close relationship between effort and survival. In warmer and more stable environments, that relationship can loosen. The body still works, still adapts, still moves, but it no longer has to preserve the same balance between heat, effort, and energy every day. During the Ice Age, even simple inactivity could have different consequences than it does now. Stillness was not always restful in the modern sense. It could mean cooling down, stiffening, or allowing the body to drift toward a state that made the next movement harder rather than easier. In that kind of world, movement often helped prevent decline before it became serious. The body learned to remain engaged not because it was chasing strength as an outcome, but because engagement itself supported warmth, mobility, and readiness. Over time, that creates a body that is accustomed to doing more than one job at once. Muscles are not only producing force, they are helping regulate temperature, protect stability, and sustain the capacity to continue. This kind of cold-shaped life may also have influenced recovery. Recovery in harsh conditions is rarely complete or luxurious. The body does not always return to a perfect baseline before effort begins again. Instead, it often works while partially fatigued, partially recovered, and still exposed to the next demand. That does not sound like an ideal system, but it does shape a particular kind of physical resilience. A body that repeatedly functions under incomplete recovery may become especially adapted to sustained, moderate demand, even if it is not optimized for maximum output in short, isolated moments. This distinction matters because when people imagine strength, they often think of peak force. But much of the strength that would have mattered during the Ice Age was not dramatic. It was the strength to continue, to stabilize, to endure exposure, and to keep moving while the body was not fully restored. As climates gradually warmed after the Ice Age, many human groups entered conditions where cold no longer imposed the same constant discipline on the body. The environment still created hardship, but in many places the body no longer had to preserve heat with the same urgency or move in order to remain functional through exposure. That change may seem small, yet over generations it alters the body's priorities. When warmth becomes easier to maintain, the body no longer needs to time movement so closely to survival. Effort can become more selective, more delayed, and more separate from basic regulation. This is one way strength may have changed after the Ice Age, not because human biology suddenly failed, but because the body was no longer being shaped by the same cold logic that had once linked movement, warmth, and survival so tightly together. Anthropological and physiological evidence supports the broader idea that cold environments place distinctive demands on the body, though we should be careful not to overstate uniformity across all ancient humans. Different groups lived in different conditions, and the Ice Age was not one single climate everywhere. Still, the larger pattern remains useful. Regular exposure to colder, less predictable environments tends to increase the importance of full-body engagement, energy balance, and sustained movement. When those pressures ease, the body reorganizes accordingly. The result is not a simple fall from strength into weakness. It is a shift from one kind of body-world relationship to another. The body that endures cold is trained by necessity to remain active, integrated, and responsive. The body that rests in more stable conditions can afford to be different, and somewhere in that long transition, human strength may have begun to change, not because the body lost its power all at once, but because the world stopped asking for the same kind of power every day. When cold is present not as an occasional discomfort but as a steady condition, the body begins to organize itself around conserving and distributing energy in a very careful way. Every movement carries a cost, but that cost is measured not only in effort, but in how much warmth can be maintained afterward. During the Ice Age, this balance would have shaped how people moved through their day. Movements that wasted energy without purpose could not be sustained for long, yet complete stillness was also not always an option. The body had to find a middle path, where effort was steady, controlled, and efficient enough to support both motion and heat at the same time. This creates a form of strength that is closely tied to economy. Muscles are not used for sudden bursts unless necessary. Instead, they are engaged in ways that allow the body to continue without exhausting its limited reserves. Over time, this pattern reinforces a kind of strength that favors endurance, stability, and continuity rather than brief peaks of force. The body learns to spread effort across time, avoiding sharp rises and falls that would be harder to recover from in a cold environment with uncertain resources. This is different from a body that can afford to expend energy freely and then recover in comfort. In warmer and more stable conditions, energy management changes. The body is less constrained by the need to maintain heat through movement. It can afford to be less precise in how energy is used, because the consequences of inefficiency are not as immediate. This does not mean that effort disappears, but it allows for greater variation. Movements can become more abrupt, more isolated, and less tied to a continuous rhythm. The body no longer has to maintain the same careful balance between effort and warmth at all times. Over generations, this shift can influence how strength is expressed. It may become more situational, appearing in response to specific tasks, rather than being sustained as a constant background condition. Another important aspect of cold environments is how they influence posture and tension. In lower temperatures, the body often adopts positions that reduce exposure and conserve heat. Shoulders may draw inward, limbs may remain closer to the body, and movements may become more compact. While this can limit certain ranges of motion, it also creates a continuous low level of muscular engagement. The body is rarely completely relaxed in the way it might be in a warm and protected environment. This subtle, ongoing tension contributes to the maintenance of strength, not through large movements, but through sustained activation over time. When conditions become warmer and more predictable, the body can release much of this constant tension. It can extend more freely, rest more completely, and disengage from the need to maintain heat through posture alone. This relaxation is not harmful in itself, but it does change the baseline level of muscular engagement. Over time, the body becomes accustomed to deeper states of rest, with clearer distinctions between activity and inactivity. This again shifts how strength is maintained. It becomes less tied to posture and background tension, and more dependent on moments of deliberate use. Cold also influences how quickly the body can move and how it responds to fatigue. In colder conditions, rapid, repeated bursts of movement can be costly if they lead to excessive energy loss or increase the risk of injury when the body is less flexible. This may encourage a steadier pace, where movements are controlled and sustained rather than sudden and explosive. Such a pattern would favor a kind of strength that supports continuation rather than intensity. As the climate warmed, these constraints eased. The body could move more freely, take advantage of improved conditions, and vary its pace without the same level of risk. This freedom allows for different forms of physical expression, but it also reduces the need to maintain the same consistent, controlled engagement that cold environments once required. Archaeological and physiological research does not provide a complete reconstruction of how every individual body functioned, but it does suggest that environmental conditions play a significant role in shaping how energy is used and how movement is structured. The Ice Age, with its colder and more demanding conditions, likely encouraged a style of movement that was efficient, continuous, and closely tied to survival. As those conditions changed, the body adapted to a new set of priorities. The careful balance between effort and warmth became less central, and with it, the form of strength that depended on that balance began to shift. This does not mean that humans became weaker in a simple sense. It suggests that the type of strength that once supported life in cold environments became less necessary, and therefore less constantly maintained. The body, always responsive, followed the new conditions, and in doing so, it began to express strength in ways that were shaped not by cold and constraint, but by the growing space between effort, warmth, and survival. There is also a quieter difference between a body shaped by cold and a body shaped by comfort, and it appears in what each body must be ready for before anything even happens. In a colder world, the body often cannot wait until a challenge fully arrives before it begins to prepare. It has to remain slightly ahead of the environment, holding itself in a state of partial readiness because delay can carry a cost. Muscles may need to engage before surfaces become too unstable, before fingers lose dexterity, before fatigue deepens under exposure, or before the loss of warmth begins to affect judgment and coordination. This does not create constant dramatic strain, but it does encourage a body that is quietly prepared more often than not. Readiness itself becomes part of survival. That matters because strength is not only built through visible effort, it is also sustained through the body's habit of staying available for effort at short notice. During the Ice Age, that habit may have been reinforced again and again by ordinary conditions. The ground could change, weather could shift, daylight could narrow, and distances could prove longer than expected. A body living inside that uncertainty could not fully separate recovery from preparation. Even at rest, some part of the system remained oriented toward the next demand. In warmer and more stable conditions, that partial readiness becomes less necessary. The body can afford to relax more completely between tasks. It can wait longer before responding. It can return more fully to stillness, without the same immediate risk. This is one of the subtle ways climate may have influenced strength after the Ice Age. When readiness is no longer required as often, the body no longer maintains it in the same quiet, continuous way. Strength then shifts from being a condition carried in the background to something more episodic, called forward when needed rather than held in reserve at all times. This change may seem small, but over long periods it affects how the body organizes itself. A body that is often prepared will distribute muscular engagement, balance, and coordination differently from a body that is allowed deeper intervals of disengagement. Cold also shapes the relationship between the body and time. In harsh environments, time is not experienced only as a sequence of hours. It is experienced through windows of opportunity. There are moments when movement is possible, when resources can be reached, when exposure is manageable, and when the body still has enough energy to act effectively. Missing those windows can matter. That means physical effort during the Ice Age was not only frequent, it was often tied to timing that the body could not fully control. This encourages a different form of strength, one connected not merely to force or endurance, but to readiness under uncertainty. The body learns to act when conditions allow, not only when it feels fully recovered or fully comfortable. Over generations, living within that rhythm may have supported a form of strength that was less about isolated output, and more about staying physically available across changing circumstances. As climates warmed and environments stabilized after the Ice Age, those narrow windows likely widened in many regions. Movement could be distributed more flexibly. The body did not always need to remain poised between exposure and action in the same way. A person could rest longer, delay effort, or divide tasks across more predictable conditions. This did not eliminate physical demand, but it softened the urgency of preparation. When urgency decreases, readiness becomes easier to release. And when readiness is released often enough, strength begins to lose one of the hidden conditions that once sustained it. Not force itself, but the quiet habit of being prepared to use force at any moment. Anthropological evidence cannot measure this inner state directly, and we should not pretend to know exactly how every Ice Age body felt from one hour to the next. But the broader logic remains grounded. Colder, harsher, and less predictable environments reward bodies that remain partially engaged, partially prepared, and less able to fall into complete physical ease. More stable environments permit greater separation between challenge and response. That separation changes how the body allocates effort, stores energy, and maintains capacity. The answer to the title's question continues to unfold here with the same quiet pattern. Humans may not have lost strength after the Ice Age in the sense of sudden biological damage. They may have lost part of the environmental pressure that once required constant readiness. And with that loss, the body gradually stopped carrying strength in the same continuous way. It was not only the cold itself that mattered, but the kind of life cold demanded in advance. A life where the body had to stay close to action even during moments that looked like rest, and where strength survived not as an occasional performance, but as a low, steady presence woven into the body before the next need had even arrived. When the Ice Age began to recede, the change did not arrive as a single moment that could be clearly marked by those living through it. It unfolded slowly, across generations, as temperatures moderated and ecosystems adjusted to new conditions. Glaciers retreated, landscapes opened, and in many regions the patterns of plants and animals began to stabilize in ways that had not been possible under colder extremes. This did not remove difficulty from human life, but it altered the structure of that difficulty. Instead of facing constant environmental pressure from multiple directions at once, the body increasingly encountered conditions that were more predictable, even if still challenging. That shift towards stability is subtle, yet it plays an important role in understanding how strength may have changed over time. In a more stable environment, the relationship between effort and necessity begins to loosen. During the Ice Age, movement was often tied directly to immediate needs that could not be delayed for long. After the climate warmed, certain tasks could be spaced out, repeated less frequently, or approached with more choice in timing. This does not mean that people stopped working or moving, but it introduces a new pattern where effort is no longer as tightly bound to survival in every moment. The body, always responsive to patterns rather than single events, begins to adapt to this new rhythm. One of the first changes may have appeared in how distance was experienced. In colder and more uncertain conditions, movement across large areas was often necessary to locate resources that were unevenly distributed. As ecosystems became more stable, some resources could be found with greater regularity within smaller ranges. This did not eliminate movement, but it reduced the need for long, continuous travel in certain contexts. Over time, this could influence how often the body engaged in extended periods of walking, carrying, and navigating varied terrain. Strength, which had been supported by those repeated patterns, would begin to reflect the new distribution of effort. Another important shift lies in how the body encounters uncertainty. During the Ice Age, uncertainty was often immediate and persistent. A change in weather, a missed opportunity, or a delay in movement could have direct consequences. As conditions stabilized, uncertainty did not disappear, but it became less constant in some environments. The body no longer had to remain in the same continuous state of readiness to respond to unpredictable changes. This allowed for longer periods where effort could be reduced without the same immediate cost. Over time, this alters the baseline level of engagement that the body maintains. It becomes easier to move in and out of activity, rather than sustaining it across the entire day. The structure of daily life also began to shift in ways that are difficult to see from a distance but significant over long periods. With more predictable access to resources in certain regions, people could begin to return to the same locations more frequently. This does not yet imply full settlement, but it introduces the idea that movement can become more patterned and less exploratory. When paths are repeated and environments become familiar, the body encounters fewer surprises. Movement can become more efficient, but also more limited in variation. The wide range of adjustments required by constantly changing terrain may begin to narrow. Strength, once supported by varied and unpredictable conditions, begins to reorganize around more consistent patterns of use. Archaeological evidence reflects this gradual transition. Changes in tool use, settlement patterns, and subsistence strategies suggest that human groups adapted to new environmental conditions in diverse ways. Some populations remained highly mobile, while others began to show signs of increased stability in their movements. These shifts did not occur uniformly, and it is important not to generalize too broadly. However, the overall trend points toward a world where the body was no longer required to respond to the same continuous combination of pressures that defined much of the Ice Age. This does not mean that strength disappeared. It means that the conditions that once reinforced it at every moment became less dominant. The body, as always, followed the demands placed upon it. When those demands became more predictable, more spaced out, and less tightly connected to immediate survival, strength began to change in how it was expressed and maintained. It became less of a constant background presence and more of a capacity that could be drawn upon when needed. This is the quiet beginning of a transition that unfolds over thousands of years, where the human body moves from one kind of relationship with the environment to another, carrying forward its abilities, but reorganizing them in response to a world that no longer asks the same questions in the same way. As environments became more stable after the Ice Age, another change began to take shape, not only in how people moved, but in how they related to the places they moved through. When resources appear with greater regularity in certain areas, the need to range widely begins to soften, even if it does not disappear entirely. Over time, this allows human groups to return to familiar locations more often, to recognize patterns in the land, and to organize their movement in ways that are less driven by constant uncertainty. This does not yet mean permanent settlement, but it introduces a shift from continuous searching toward more repeated use of space. That shift matters because the body adapts not only to how much it moves, but to how varied that movement is. In a world where landscapes are constantly changing or unfamiliar, the body must respond to a wide range of conditions. Each step may require adjustment, each route may differ, and each task may involve new combinations of effort. This variety supports a broad engagement of muscles, joints, and coordination systems. When movement becomes more patterned, even if it remains physically demanding, the range of variation can begin to narrow. The same paths are taken more often, the same tasks are repeated, and the same kinds of effort are applied again and again. Over long periods, this can influence how strength is distributed across the body. It may remain present, but it becomes more specialized, less spread across the full range of possible movements. This transition can be seen in early archaeological evidence where certain locations show repeated human presence over time. These sites suggest that people were beginning to organize their activities around places that offered relatively reliable access to food, water, or other resources. While mobility remained an important part of life, it was no longer always driven by the same level of unpredictability. The body, in turn, began to experience a different pattern of demand. Movement was still necessary, but it was more structured, more familiar, and in some cases less varied than before. Another important aspect of this shift is how it changes the relationship between effort and anticipation. In a less predictable environment, the body often moves without knowing exactly what it will encounter. This requires constant readiness to adjust, to respond, and to engage different forms of strength as conditions change. When environments become more predictable, anticipation becomes easier. The body can begin to expect certain patterns, to prepare for known tasks, and to rely on repeated solutions. This does not remove physical effort, but it reduces the need for continuous adaptation to unknown conditions. Over time, this can influence how strength is maintained. It becomes more closely tied to specific activities rather than to a wide range of possible responses. The difference is subtle, but important. Strength that develops in response to varied and unpredictable movement tends to remain broadly distributed, supporting many kinds of action. Strength that develops in more predictable contexts may become more focused, supporting the tasks that are performed most often. This is not a decline, but a reorganization. The body follows the patterns it experiences most frequently, reinforcing what is used and allowing other capacities to become less central. Evidence from human skeletal remains reflects this gradual change. Some later populations, especially those associated with more stable patterns of living, show signs of repeated use in specific areas of the body, suggesting that certain movements were performed regularly while others were less emphasized. Earlier remains often indicate a more generalized pattern of loading, consistent with a wider range of activities. These differences should not be overstated, but they align with the broader idea that as environments stabilized, human movement became more structured and less variable in certain contexts. This brings the question of strength into a new light. If strength during the Ice Age was supported by constant variation and continuous adaptation, then a reduction in variation may lead to a different form of strength, one that is still present, but no longer spread across the same range of functions. The body does not lose its ability, but it begins to prioritize efficiency within familiar patterns. Over generations, this shift can become more pronounced, shaping how strength is expressed across populations. The Ice Age did not end strength. It ended a certain kind of environmental unpredictability that had once required the body to remain broadly prepared for many different kinds of effort. As that unpredictability eased, the body adapted to a world where movement could be more predictable, more repeated, and more selective. And within that adaptation, strength began to change, not by disappearing, but by becoming more closely tied to the specific demands of a more stable and familiar environment. As this shift towards stability continued, another change began to emerge, one that is quieter but deeply connected to how strength is maintained over long periods. It appears in how time itself is structured within daily life. During the Ice Age, time was often organized around necessity. Movement followed the availability of resources, the presence of animals, the limits of daylight, and the demands of temperature. There was little separation between what needed to be done and when it had to be done. Effort was not easily postponed, and the body adapted to this by remaining ready to act whenever conditions required it. This created a rhythm where physical engagement was closely tied to the flow of the environment rather than to a fixed schedule. As climates became more stable and resources more predictable in certain regions, time began to change in subtle ways. Tasks could be spaced out, repeated with greater regularity, and in some cases delayed without immediate consequence. This does not suggest that life became easier, but it introduces a different kind of flexibility. The body no longer had to respond to every demand at the exact moment it appeared. Instead, effort could be organized, grouped, or even avoided for short periods. Over time, this alters how the body experiences both activity and rest. Rest becomes more complete, more distinct from effort, and more frequent in certain contexts. While this may support recovery, it also changes the continuous engagement that once sustained strength as a background condition. Another important element of this transition lies in how effort is distributed across the day. In earlier environments, effort tended to be spread out, rising and falling without clear boundaries. After the Ice Age, as patterns became more predictable, effort could become more concentrated into specific periods. A person might work intensely for a time and then rest more fully afterward. This creates a different cycle of use and recovery. Instead of maintaining a steady level of activity, the body begins to alternate between higher and lower levels of engagement. Over generations, this pattern can influence how strength is expressed. It becomes more tied to moments of activity rather than sustained quietly across all waking hours. Archaeological evidence suggests that as human groups adapted to changing environments, their ways of organizing labor also evolved. Even before fully settled agricultural societies, there are signs that some activities became more structured, repeated in familiar locations, and tied to predictable cycles. These changes do not occur everywhere at once, and they do not eliminate variability entirely, but they indicate a gradual shift in how human life was organized in relation to time and place. The body, always adapting to these patterns, begins to reflect the new structure. Strength remains present, but it is no longer reinforced by the same continuous flow of movement that once defined daily life. It becomes something that rises during periods of activity and recedes during periods of rest. This does not make the body weaker in a simple sense, but it changes the baseline from which strength operates. Instead of being a constant condition, it becomes a capacity that depends more directly on recent use. This is one of the ways the end of the Ice Age may have influenced human strength, not by removing physical ability, but by introducing a different relationship between effort and time. When effort can be delayed, grouped, or reduced without immediate consequence, the body no longer needs to sustain the same uninterrupted level of readiness. It can afford to shift between states more clearly. Over long periods, this leads to a body that is still capable, but organized differently, shaped by rhythms that include deeper rest and more distinct periods of activity. The question returns again not as a simple statement, but as a reflection on how small changes accumulate. If strength was once supported by a life where time and effort were tightly bound to survival, then what happens when time begins to open, when effort can be rearranged, and when the body no longer has to remain engaged in the same continuous way? The answer may not lie in a single moment of loss, but in a gradual reshaping of how the body lives within time itself, carrying forward its abilities while adapting to a world that no longer requires strength to be present in every moment of the day. As the world continued to warm and stabilize after the Ice Age, one of the most important shifts began to unfold not only in climate, but in how humans obtained their food. For a long time, food had been something that required movement across space, shaped by uncertainty, season, and the behavior of animals and plants that could not be controlled. The body had to respond to that uncertainty through repeated effort, often without knowing when or where the next success would come. This pattern did not guarantee strength, but it did keep physical demand closely tied to the basic act of staying alive. When food sources began to appear more regularly in certain environments, that relationship started to change. This did not happen everywhere at once, and it did not immediately transform human life into something stable or predictable. But in some regions, especially where climate conditions supported more consistent plant growth or animal presence, people could begin to rely on familiar areas for food with greater confidence. Over time, this reduced the need to move constantly across large and uncertain distances. Movement remained part of life, but it became more localized, more repeated, and in some cases less varied. This shift matters because the body adapts not only to how much effort is required, but to how that effort is structured. During the Ice Age, the effort involved in finding food often included long periods of walking, tracking, carrying, and adjusting to changing terrain. These activities engage the whole body in a continuous and varied way. When food becomes more predictable, some of that variability begins to narrow. Tasks may still be physically demanding, but they are more likely to follow familiar patterns. The same routes, the same methods, and the same types of effort are repeated over time. This can lead to a form of strength that is still present, but more specialized, focused on the demands that occur most often rather than on a wide range of possible challenges. Another important change appears in how effort is distributed. In a more unpredictable environment, effort must be sustained even without immediate success. The body learns to continue through uncertainty, maintaining readiness across long periods. When food becomes more predictable, effort can be more directly linked to expected outcomes. A person may know where to go, what to do, and how long it might take. This reduces the need for continuous searching and allows for more defined periods of activity. Over time, this can change how the body organizes energy. Instead of maintaining a steady baseline of engagement, it may begin to alternate more clearly between active and inactive periods. Archaeological and anthropological evidence suggests that even before fully developed agriculture, human groups were already adapting to environments in ways that made resource use more consistent in certain areas. This does not mean that life became easy or that physical demand disappeared. It means that the pattern of demand changed. The body was no longer required to respond to the same level of unpredictability in every moment. Instead, it began to operate within environments where some aspects of survival were more stable, even if others remained challenging. This transition becomes even more visible when early forms of cultivation and animal management begin to appear in later periods. These developments further reduce the need for constant movement across large distances. Food can be produced or managed within a smaller area, allowing for a more fixed relationship between people and place. This has profound effects on how the body is. Movement becomes more repetitive, more localized, and often more focused on specific tasks rather than on broad exploration and adaptation. Strength does not disappear in this process. It is still required for labor, for carrying, for building, and for maintaining daily life. But it begins to take on a different form. Instead of being supported by continuous, varied movement across unpredictable terrain, it is shaped by repeated actions within more stable environments. The body adapts by reinforcing what is used most often and reducing what is no longer required as frequently. Over generations, this leads to subtle but meaningful changes in how strength is expressed. The question of why humans lost strength after the Ice Age continues to unfold here. It is not that food became easy, but that it became more predictable in certain contexts, and with that predictability came a shift in how effort was organized. The body, always responsive to its environment, began to follow this new structure, gradually moving away from a pattern of constant, varied engagement toward one that allowed for more repetition, more localization, and more separation between effort and necessity. As food became more predictable in certain regions, another subtle change followed, one that shaped not only how often people moved, but how their bodies experienced effort within each day. When resources are uncertain, effort tends to spread outward. A person may travel long distances without knowing exactly when success will come, and the body learns to sustain activity across that uncertainty. But when resources become more reliable, effort can begin to concentrate. Instead of searching widely, people may return to the same locations, perform similar tasks, and complete them within more defined periods. This shift from dispersed effort to concentrated effort changes how strength is maintained. It becomes less about continuing across long, uncertain stretches, and more about completing specific actions within a narrow window of time. This distinction may seem small, but over generations it influences how the body organizes its capabilities. In a pattern of dispersed effort, the body maintains a steady level of engagement, adjusting gradually to fatigue and continuing without clear interruption. In a pattern of concentrated effort, the body may work more intensely for shorter periods, followed by more complete rest. Both require strength, but they support different expressions of it. The first encourages continuity and endurance across varied conditions. The second allows for more defined cycles of use and recovery, where strength is called upon more selectively. Archaeological evidence suggests that as human groups adapted to more stable environments, many tasks became increasingly repetitive. Grinding, processing, carrying within a limited range, and working with materials in familiar locations all became more common in certain contexts. These activities could still be physically demanding, but they often involved repeated motions rather than the wide variations seen in more mobile lifeways. Over time, repetition shapes the body in specific ways. Certain muscles and movements are reinforced, while others are used less frequently. Strength does not disappear, but it becomes more focused, less distributed across the full range of possible actions. This change is visible in skeletal remains, where patterns of wear and development sometimes indicate repeated use of particular joints or muscle groups. Such evidence should be interpreted carefully, as it varies across populations and environments, but it supports the broader idea that the structure of daily effort was changing. The body was no longer adapting to constant variation alone. It was adapting to patterns that repeated over time, often within more limited spaces. Another important effect of predictability is how it changes anticipation. When the outcome of effort becomes more certain, the body can prepare differently. It no longer needs to remain equally ready for a wide range of unknown conditions. Instead, it can adjust to expected tasks. This reduces the need for constant broad readiness and allows the body to specialize around what is most frequently required. Over generations, this specialization can influence how strength is expressed. It may remain strong in certain directions, but less so in others that are no longer regularly engaged. The Ice Age environment had encouraged a kind of strength that was flexible and widely distributed, because the body never knew exactly what would be required next. As environments stabilized and food became more predictable, that uncertainty decreased. The body could rely more on repetition and less on continuous adaptation. This did not remove effort from daily life, but it changed its structure. Effort became more organized, more localized, and more tied to known tasks. The body followed this pattern, reinforcing what it used most often and allowing other capacities to fade into the background. This is another way to approach the question of lost strength. It may not have been lost in the sense of disappearing entirely. It may have been reshaped by a world that no longer required the same breadth of physical response. Strength became more efficient within familiar patterns, but less embedded across the full range of movement that once defined survival in colder and more uncertain environments. Over time, this quiet reorganization becomes part of the human body itself, carried forward not as a sudden change, but as a gradual adjustment to a world where effort could be more focused, more predictable, and more limited in its variation than it had been before. There is one more quiet shift that follows when food becomes more predictable, and it appears in how the body relates to uncertainty itself. During much of the Ice Age, the body could not rely on clear expectations. Even familiar places could change, and success was never guaranteed. This meant that effort was often carried out without certainty of reward. The body learned to remain engaged not because it knew the outcome, but because it had to continue anyway. Over time, this kind of engagement reinforces a broad readiness, where strength is not directed toward a single task, but held in reserve for whatever might be required next. It is not only the action that matters, but the willingness of the body to remain physically available across unknown conditions. When environments become more stable and food sources more reliable, that relationship begins to change. The body is no longer asked to operate under the same level of uncertainty. Effort can be tied more directly to expected outcomes. A person may know where food is likely to be found, how to obtain it, and what kind of work will be required. This does not remove difficulty, but it changes the nature of effort. Instead of being open-ended and uncertain, it becomes more directed and predictable. The body, in response, begins to reorganize its readiness. It no longer needs to maintain the same broad range of preparation at all times. Instead, it can narrow its focus towards specific, repeated tasks. This narrowing has important consequences for how strength is expressed. Strength that develops under uncertain conditions tends to remain flexible, supporting many different kinds of movement and adjustment. Strength that develops under predictable conditions may become more efficient within a narrower range. The body becomes better at doing what it does often, but less engaged with movements that are no longer required as frequently. Over long periods, this can lead to a form of strength that is still present, but less widely distributed across the body. It is not a loss of ability, but a shift in emphasis. Archaeological evidence offers indirect support for this idea. Patterns of wear on bones and joints in later populations often suggest repeated use of specific movements, while earlier remains sometimes indicate a broader distribution of physical activity. These patterns should not be interpreted as uniform or universal, but they align with the broader understanding that as environments stabilized, human activity became more structured and less variable in certain contexts. The body adapted to these patterns, reinforcing what was used most often and allowing other capacities to become less central. Another effect of reduced uncertainty is how it changes the pace of life. In more unpredictable environments, the body must remain prepared to act when opportunities appear. Timing is less controlled, and effort may need to begin before the body feels fully ready. In more predictable settings, timing can be managed more easily. Tasks can be planned, delayed, or repeated at regular intervals. This allows for clearer separation between preparation, action, and rest. While this can support efficiency, it also reduces the need for continuous readiness. The body no longer needs to hold strength in a constant background state. It can allow that state to rise and fall with activity. This is where the idea of lost strength becomes more nuanced. The body has not lost its capacity to be strong. It has lost the constant requirement to remain broadly prepared for uncertain conditions. That requirement, present during the Ice Age, helped sustain a form of strength that was flexible, distributed, and continuously engaged. As that requirement fades, the body adapts to a different pattern, one where strength is more closely tied to specific tasks and moments of use. Over generations, this quiet shift becomes part of how the human body operates. It reflects not a decline, but a change in relationship between the body and the world it moves through. The Ice Age asked for a body that could respond to uncertainty with continuous readiness. The world that followed allowed for more predictability, more structure, and more selective use of effort. And within that change, strength began to take on a different role, no longer woven into every possible action, but shaped by the narrower demands of a more stable and predictable environment. As stability increased in certain regions after the Ice Age, another shift began to take form, one that would gradually reshape how the human body moved through space. This shift was not only about food or climate, but about the emerging possibility of staying longer in one place. Early forms of repeated occupation began to appear, where groups returned to the same locations season after season, sometimes remaining there for extended periods when conditions allowed. This did not yet represent fully settled life in the later sense, but it marked a change in how movement was organized. Instead of being driven primarily by the need to move across wide and uncertain landscapes, movement could begin to center around familiar areas. That change, though subtle at first, has important implications for how strength is maintained. When people move through large, varied environments, the body is constantly adjusting. Each new path introduces different surfaces, different demands, and different combinations of effort. Over time, this supports a broad engagement of the body, where strength is distributed across many forms of movement. When activity begins to focus around more stable locations, that variation can narrow. The same terrain is encountered repeatedly, the same distances are traveled, and the same tasks are performed within a more limited space. This does not reduce effort, but it changes its character. Strength becomes more closely tied to familiar patterns rather than to a wide range of unpredictable conditions. Archaeological evidence from the later phases of the Ice Age and the early periods that followed suggest that some human groups began to organize their lives around locations that offered reliable access to water, food, and shelter. These sites often show repeated use over time, with layers of activity indicating that people returned again and again. This pattern reflects a gradual shift in how humans related to space. The body, in turn, begins to experience movement not as continuous exploration, but as repeated engagement with known environments. This repetition influences how strength is developed and maintained. Instead of adapting to constant variation, the body begins to reinforce the movements that are performed most often. Another important aspect of this transition is how it changes the scale of movement. In highly mobile lifeways, distance is a regular part of survival. Walking long stretches, carrying materials across uneven ground, and navigating changing landscapes all contribute to a form of strength that is closely tied to endurance and adaptability. As movement becomes more localized, the body may still perform physically demanding tasks, but the scale can shift. Effort becomes concentrated within a smaller area, often involving repeated actions rather than extended travel. This alters the balance between different types of strength. Endurance across distance may become less central, while strength related to specific tasks may become more prominent. The structure of daily life also begins to change in ways that influence the body over time. When people remain in one place for longer periods, they interact more deeply with that environment. Tasks such as preparing materials, maintaining shelters, and processing resources become more regular and structured. These activities can be physically demanding, but they often involve repeated motions within a familiar setting. Over generations, this repetition shapes how the body develops. Certain movements are reinforced, while others become less frequent. Strength becomes more specialized, reflecting the demands of a more stable and localized way of living. This shift does not occur everywhere at the same pace, and it is important to recognize the diversity of human experiences during this period. Many groups remained highly mobile, continuing to move across large landscapes in response to seasonal changes and resource availability. However, the broader trend toward increased stability in some regions marks an important transition. It introduces a new relationship between the body and space, where movement is no longer defined solely by the need to explore and adapt to constantly changing conditions. Instead, it becomes tied to maintaining and working within a known environment. This transition helps illuminate another layer of the question about strength. If the Ice Age supported a form of strength that was shaped by continuous movement across varied terrain, then the emergence of more stable patterns of living would gradually reshape that strength. The body does not become incapable, but it reorganizes around the demands it encounters most often. Movement becomes more repeated, more localized, and more predictable. Strength follows this pattern, becoming less about broad adaptability and more about efficiency within familiar tasks. Over time, this quiet shift contributes to the larger transformation that unfolded after the Ice Age, where the human body continued to adapt, not by losing its abilities outright, but by aligning itself with a world that no longer required the same constant negotiation with distance, terrain, and uncertainty. As people began to return to the same locations more frequently, another change slowly took shape, one that is not always visible in large movements, but becomes clear in how daily effort is organized. When a place is used repeatedly, it begins to carry a kind of memory. Paths become familiar, surfaces become known, and the body no longer needs to interpret every step as something new. This familiarity reduces the need for constant adjustment. Movements that once required attention and variation begin to settle into more predictable patterns. Over time, this influences how the body distributes effort. Instead of engaging widely across many possibilities, it can begin to rely on established routines. This does not remove physical work, but it changes the kind of work that is done. In earlier, more mobile conditions, the body had to remain prepared for variation. Each movement could present a slightly different challenge, requiring small but continuous adaptations. This supported a form of strength that was spread across many systems at once. Balance, coordination, grip, posture, and endurance were all engaged together in response to changing terrain and conditions. When movement becomes tied to familiar places, that variability begins to narrow. The body encounters fewer unexpected situations, and the need for constant adjustment decreases. Over time, strength becomes more aligned with repetition rather than variation. This shift is subtle, but it has lasting effects. Repetition reinforces specific pathways of movement. The same joints move in similar ranges, the same muscles are activated in familiar sequences, and the body becomes efficient within those patterns. Efficiency, in this sense, is not a loss, but it does mean that the body is no longer maintaining the same breadth of engagement across all possible movements. Strength becomes more concentrated, more focused on what is done most often. Other capacities remain, but they are used less frequently and may become less central over time. Archaeological findings provide indirect support for this process. Sites that show repeated occupation often reveal evidence of structured activities taking place in the same locations over long periods. Tools are used in consistent ways, materials are processed in familiar areas, and the organization of space reflects repeated patterns of behavior. These patterns suggest that daily life was becoming more structured, with tasks that could be anticipated and repeated. The body, adapting to this structure, begins to reflect it in how strength is expressed and maintained. Another important aspect of repeated occupation is how it changes the relationship between effort and attention. In unfamiliar environments, movement often requires continuous awareness. The body must respond to uneven ground, shifting surfaces, and unpredictable conditions. This keeps many systems engaged at once, even during simple actions. In familiar environments, some of that attention can relax. The body no longer needs to monitor every detail with the same intensity. Movements can become more automatic, guided by memory rather than constant adjustment. While this reduces cognitive load, it also reduces the subtle, continuous engagement that once supported a broader form of strength. This does not imply that people in more stable environments were inactive or physically weak. Many tasks remained demanding, and daily life still required significant effort. The difference lies in how that effort is structured. Instead of being spread across varied and unpredictable conditions, it becomes organized around repeated actions in known settings. Over generations, this organization shapes the body. Strength remains, but it becomes more closely tied to specific tasks and less connected to a wide range of adaptive responses. The Ice Age had required a body that could respond to change at every step, where familiarity was limited and variation was constant. As people began to live within more familiar spaces, the body no longer needed to maintain that same level of continuous adaptation. It could rely more on repetition, more on efficiency, and more on established patterns. This represents another step in the gradual transformation of human strength. Not a sudden decline, but a quiet narrowing of how strength is distributed and used. The body continues to follow the demands of its environment, and as those demands become more structured and predictable, strength begins to take on a different form, shaped not by constant variation, but by the steady repetition of life within familiar places. As repeated occupation of the same places continued, one more quiet change began to shape the body, and it appears in how effort is distributed within space itself. When people move across large, varied landscapes, effort is spread outward. The body engages in many directions across different distances, responding to terrain that does not repeat in simple ways. But when life becomes more centered around a familiar location, effort begins to gather inward. Tasks are performed within a limited area, often returning to the same points again and again. Over time, this inward concentration of movement changes how the body organizes strength. Instead of being distributed across wide-ranging actions, strength becomes anchored to specific zones of activity. This does not reduce the importance of physical work. It changes how that work is structured. Carrying may occur over shorter distances but with more repetition. Lifting may happen in the same place, using similar motions. Postures may be held in consistent ways as tasks are repeated within a known environment. The body adapts by reinforcing these patterns, becoming efficient within the space it occupies most often. What begins to fade is not strength itself, but the need to express it across constantly shifting conditions. The body is no longer asked to move through as many different environments. and so it does not maintain the same breadth of physical response. This shift can also be understood through how the body relates to boundaries. In more mobile lifeways, there are few clear limits to where movement might go. The body remains open to change, prepared to adjust to new terrain, new distances, and new combinations of effort. When life becomes more localized, boundaries become more defined. The body learns the limits of its space, the paths it will take, the surfaces it will encounter. Movement becomes more contained, more predictable, and less exploratory. Over time, this containment influences how strength is maintained. It becomes closely tied to the known environment, rather than to a wide range of possibilities. Archaeological evidence supports the idea that as human groups use certain locations repeatedly, their activities became more structured within those spaces. Areas for specific tasks can sometimes be identified, suggesting that daily life was organized around repeated patterns in the same places. This organization reflects a change in how people interacted with their environment, and the body would have adapted to that structure. Strength, once supported by constant movement across varied landscapes, begins to align with the demands of a more contained and organized space. Another subtle effect of this change is how it alters the relationship between movement and discovery. In unfamiliar environments, movement often leads to new conditions, requiring the body to adjust in real time. This keeps many systems engaged, even during routine actions. In familiar environments, movement leads to known outcomes. The body can rely on memory rather than constant adjustment. While this increases efficiency, it reduces the need for continuous adaptation. Strength, in this context, becomes more stable but also more limited in scope. It is still present, but it is not exercised across the same range of conditions. This does not suggest that human bodies became weaker in a simple sense. It suggests that the type of strength maintained by the body began to reflect the structure of life around it. During the Ice Age, that structure required constant negotiation with space, distance, and variation. Afterward, as life became more centered and predictable in some regions, the body no longer needed to maintain the same wide-ranging engagement. Strength followed this shift, becoming more focused, more localized, and more closely tied to repeated tasks within familiar boundaries. Over generations, this change becomes part of the body itself. It is not the result of a single decision or a single event, but of countless small adjustments as people lived within environments that asked different things of them. The Ice Age had shaped a body that was ready to move outward, to adapt to variation, and to distribute effort across a wide landscape. The world that followed allowed for a body that could remain within a smaller space, repeating known actions, conserving energy in different ways, and relying more on stability than on constant adaptation. Within that transition, strength did not vanish, but it began to take on a quieter, more contained form, reflecting the boundaries within which the body now lived. As life became more organized around familiar places and repeated tasks, another shift began to take shape within the body, one that is less visible than changes in movement or environment, but just as important. It appears in how strength is distributed across the body itself. During the Ice Age, strength was rarely concentrated in one area. The demands of movement across varied terrain, combined with carrying, balancing, and adapting to constant change, required the body to function as a connected system. Muscles did not act in isolation. The arms, legs, core, and smaller stabilizing structures all contributed together to maintain movement across long periods. This created a form of strength that was not easily separated into parts. It was spread across the body, supported by continuous interaction between different regions. When daily life begins to revolve around more stable environments and repeated tasks, that distribution can begin to change. The body is still active, but it is no longer required to engage every system in the same way at the same time. Certain movements become more frequent, while others are used less often. Over time, this leads to a shift where strength becomes more concentrated in specific areas of the body, depending on the demands of those repeated tasks. For example, activities that involve carrying, lifting, or processing materials in fixed locations may emphasize particular muscle groups more than others. The body adapts by reinforcing what is used most often, while reducing the emphasis on movements that are no longer required as frequently. This does not mean that the body becomes incapable of broader movement. but it does mean that the constant integration of the whole body becomes less central. Strength begins to appear in parts rather than as a continuous distributed condition. Archaeological evidence provides indirect support for this pattern. Skeletal remains from later periods sometimes show signs of repeated stress in specific regions, suggesting that certain movements were performed regularly over long periods. In contrast, earlier remains often reflect more generalized loading across the body, consistent with varied and continuous activity. These patterns are not uniform and must be interpreted with care, but they align with the broader understanding that changes in daily life influence how the body is used and how strength is maintained. Another important aspect of this transition is how it affects coordination. When the body is regularly engaged in varied movement, coordination between different systems is continuously reinforced. Balance, posture, and force production are linked together through repeated use. When movement becomes more specialized, coordination may still be present, but it is reinforced within narrower contexts. The body becomes efficient at specific combinations of movement rather than maintaining the same level of integration across all possible actions. Over time, this can influence how strength is expressed. It becomes more effective within familiar tasks, but less broadly engaged across the full range of movement that once defined survival in more variable environments. This shift is subtle and does not appear as a sudden change. It unfolds gradually as patterns of life change across generations. The body, always responsive, follows these patterns closely. It does not maintain capacities that are no longer required at the same frequency. Instead, it reallocates resources toward what is used most often. Strength, in this sense, is not lost but redistributed. It becomes more localized, more specific, and more closely tied to the structure of daily activity. This helps clarify another layer of the central question. If humans appear to have lost strength after the Ice Age, it may not be because the body became weaker in a general sense. It may be because strength was no longer maintained as a whole body condition, constantly reinforced by varied and continuous movement. Instead, it began to concentrate in specific areas, shaped by repeated tasks within more stable environments. The body did not lose its capacity to be strong, but it changed how that capacity was organized. And within that reorganization, something of the earlier, widely distributed strength became less visible, not because it vanished, but because the conditions that once sustained it across the entire body were no longer present in the same way. As strength began to concentrate in specific parts of the body, another change followed, one that is less visible in muscles themselves but appears in how different parts of the body communicate during movement. When strength is widely distributed, as it likely was during much of the Ice Age, the body relies on constant coordination between many regions at once. A step across uneven ground engages not only the legs, but the hips, spine, shoulders, and even the hands as balance shifts. Carrying an object across distance is not simply an arm task. It involves posture, breathing, and the subtle adjustments that keep the entire system stable over time. This kind of coordination is reinforced through variation, because each movement brings slightly different demands. The body remains connected through continuous adaptation. When movement becomes more repetitive and localized, coordination does not disappear, but it begins to narrow along familiar pathways. The same actions are repeated, often in similar environments, and the body learns to perform them efficiently. Over time, certain patterns of coordination are strengthened, while others are used less often. The body becomes highly effective within the movements it practices regularly, but it may no longer maintain the same level of integration across all possible forms of movement. This shift does not reduce capability in a simple way. It reorganizes it. Strength remains present, but it is supported by coordination that is more specific and less broadly distributed. This change can be understood by considering how the body handles balance and adjustment. In varied environments, balance is constantly challenged. The body must respond to uneven surfaces, shifting weight, and unpredictable changes in direction. This keeps many small stabilizing muscles active, even during simple tasks. Over time, this contributes to a form of strength that is supported by continuous micro-adjustment. When environments become more stable and movement more predictable, the need for these constant adjustments decreases. The body still maintains balance, but it does so within narrower and more familiar conditions. The subtle engagement that once supported wide-ranging coordination becomes less central. Another effect appears in how effort is transferred through the body. In varied movement, force often travels across multiple regions. A lift may begin in the legs, pass through the core, and extend into the arms. Walking across uneven terrain requires constant redistribution of weight and effort. This creates a system where strength is not isolated in one area, but shared across the body. When tasks become more repetitive, effort may begin and end within a more limited range. Movements can become more contained, with less need for full body transfer. Over time, this changes how strength is experienced. It becomes more localized, supported by specific pathways rather than by continuous integration across the entire system. Archaeological evidence, while indirect, aligns with this broader pattern. Some later populations show signs of repeated use in particular joints or muscle attachments, suggesting that daily activity involved consistent, focused movements. Earlier remains often reflect a wider distribution of physical stress, consistent with varied and continuous engagement. These patterns are not universal, and they vary across regions and time periods, but they support the idea that changes in daily life influence how the body organizes both strength and coordination. This transition also affects how the body responds to unfamiliar situations. In a system that is regularly exposed to variation, the body remains practiced in adjusting to new conditions. Strength is not only about performing known tasks, but about adapting when those tasks change. When movement becomes more specialized, the body becomes highly efficient within familiar patterns, but less frequently exposed to unexpected combinations of effort. This does not mean it cannot adapt, but it means adaptation is no longer reinforced as part of everyday life. The broader implication returns to the central question. If humans appear to have lost strength after the Ice Age, part of that change may lie not in the amount of strength, but in how it is coordinated and distributed. Strength that was once supported by continuous integration across the body becomes more segmented, more focused, and more dependent on specific patterns of use. The body continues to function, to adapt, and to remain capable, but it does so within a structure that no longer requires the same level of constant full-body coordination. Over time, this quiet shift becomes part of the human condition, reflecting a world where movement is more predictable, tasks are more repeated, and strength is organized around efficiency within known patterns rather than broad readiness across unknown ones. As strength becomes more localized and coordination follows more familiar pathways, another quiet change begins to appear in how the body experiences effort itself. During the Ice Age, effort was rarely something that could be separated into distinct parts. When movement involved the whole body across varied terrain, the sensation of effort was often distributed. No single area carried the full burden for long. Instead, effort moved through the body, shifting from one region to another as conditions changed. This distribution allowed the body to continue over long periods, because no single system was asked to sustain the entire load without relief. Strength, in this context, was closely tied to the ability to share effort across the body, maintaining continuity rather than concentrating strain. When movement becomes more repetitive and localized, that distribution begins to change. Effort can start to gather in specific areas, especially when the same tasks are performed in the same way over long periods. A movement repeated many times in a familiar setting may rely heavily on particular muscles or joints, while other parts of the body remain less engaged. This creates a different experience of effort. Instead of being spread across the system, it becomes more focused, sometimes more intense within certain regions. Over time, the body adapts to this pattern by reinforcing the areas that are used most often, while allowing others to become less central. Strength remains, but it is no longer shared across the body in the same continuous way. This shift has implications for how fatigue is experienced and managed. In a system where effort is distributed, fatigue can be moderated by shifting load from one part of the body to another. The body continues moving, adjusting as needed, without any single area becoming overwhelmed too quickly. In a system where effort is concentrated, fatigue may accumulate more rapidly in specific regions. The body can still perform the task, but it does so by relying heavily on certain structures. Over time, this influences how strength is maintained. It becomes closely tied to the resilience of specific areas rather than to the continuous support of the whole body. Archaeological evidence offers indirect insight into this process. Patterns of wear and development in skeletal remains from later periods sometimes suggest repeated use of particular joints or muscle attachments, indicating that certain movements were performed frequently over long periods. Earlier remains often reflect a broader distribution of stress, consistent with more varied and continuous activity. These observations should be approached carefully, as they vary across populations and environments, but they support the broader understanding that changes in daily movement influence how effort and strength are distributed within the body. Another important aspect of this transition is how it affects the body's ability to adjust in real time. When effort is regularly distributed across many systems, the body remains practiced in shifting load, adapting to changes, and maintaining balance under varying conditions. When effort becomes more concentrated, these adjustments may occur less frequently. The body becomes efficient within its primary patterns, but less engaged in the constant redistribution that once supported a more flexible form of strength. This does not reduce capability, but it changes the underlying structure of how strength is used. The question of why humans lost strength after the Ice Age continues to unfold through these layers. It is not only about how much strength the body can produce, but about how that strength is organized, shared, and maintained. During the Ice Age, strength was supported by a system where effort moved through the body, constantly redistributed across changing conditions. As life became more stable and movement more repetitive, that redistribution became less central. Strength did not disappear, but it became more concentrated, more tied to specific tasks, and less integrated across the entire body. Over generations, this quiet reorganization becomes part of the human experience. The body continues to adapt, following the patterns it encounters most often. In doing so, it carries forward its capacity for strength, but expresses it in ways that reflect a world where movement is more predictable, effort is more focused, and the need to share physical load across the entire system is no longer as constant as it once was in colder and more uncertain environments. As these changes in movement, environment, and daily structure continued over long periods, their effects did not remain within a single lifetime. They began to accumulate across generations, shaping how bodies developed from early life onward. This is an important layer in understanding how strength may have changed after the Ice Age, because the body is not only shaped by what it does in adulthood, but by the conditions it experiences while growing. During much of the Ice Age, children would have grown up in environments where movement was closely tied to survival. From an early age, the body would be exposed to varied terrain, shifting conditions, and repeated physical demands that were part of everyday life. This does not mean that all individuals developed in the same way, but it suggests that the baseline level of physical engagement began early and continued consistently. When such patterns are present across generations, they influence not only muscle use, but also the development of bones, joints, and coordination systems. The body adapts to what it experiences repeatedly, and when those experiences are consistent across childhood and adulthood, the resulting structure reflects that continuity. As environments became more stable and patterns of life more structured after the Ice Age, the conditions of growth also began to change. Children growing up in more predictable environments may have encountered less variation in movement, more repeated tasks, and clearer separations between activity and rest. This does not imply inactivity, but it does suggest that the range of physical experiences may have narrowed in certain contexts. Over time, this influences how the body develops. Bones respond to loading during growth, becoming stronger and more robust when regularly engaged across varied conditions. When loading becomes more localized or less varied, development follows those patterns. Strength, in this sense, is not only something that is maintained in adulthood, but something that is shaped during growth through repeated exposure to physical demand. Archaeological evidence provides insight into these generational changes. Differences in skeletal structure between earlier and later populations sometimes reflect variations in habitual activity and loading. Earlier remains often show signs consistent with regular, varied physical use, while later remains in some contexts suggest more localized patterns of activity. These differences are not uniform and should not be generalized too broadly, but they indicate that changes in daily life were influencing how bodies developed over time. Another important factor is how expectations of movement are passed across generations. In highly mobile environments, The patterns of movement required for survival are learned early and reinforced continuously. The body grows into those patterns, becoming adapted to them as a normal part of life. When environments become more stable and movement patterns more structured, the expectations placed on the body also change. Certain skills and forms of effort may become less central, while others are emphasized. Over generations, this shapes not only how individuals move, but how the body itself is prepared to move. This generational perspective helps explain why changes in strength are not immediate or easily visible within a single lifetime. The body adapts gradually, following the patterns it encounters most often. When those patterns shift, the effects accumulate slowly, becoming more apparent across longer spans of time. The Ice Age did not produce a single type of human body, and its end did not create a single outcome, but across many populations and many generations, the overall trend reflects a transition in how physical demand was experienced and maintained. Strength, once supported by continuous, varied engagement from early life onward, began to reorganize as those conditions changed. It became more dependent on specific activities and less embedded in the entire structure of daily life. The question of lost strength becomes more nuanced in this context. It is not only about what adults could do, but about how bodies were formed over time. When children grow up in environments that no longer require the same range of movement and adaptation, the resulting bodies reflect those conditions. Strength is still present, but it is shaped differently, aligned with the demands that are most consistently encountered. Over generations, this creates a quiet but meaningful shift, where the body carries forward its capacity for strength, but expresses it in ways that reflect a world that no longer asks for the same continuous, varied engagement that once defined life during the Ice Age. As these generational patterns continued, another layer began to take shape, one that is less visible than bones or muscles, but still deeply connected to how strength is maintained. It appears in how habits of movement are formed and carried across time. During the Ice Age, movement was not something that needed to be taught in a structured way. It emerged naturally from the demands of the environment. Children growing up in such conditions would have learned to move by participating in daily life, gradually adapting to varied terrain, shifting weather, and the need to respond to uncertainty. These experiences were not isolated lessons. They were continuous, embedded in the rhythm of survival. Over time, this created a set of movement habits that were broad, flexible, and closely tied to the environment. The body learned not only how to move, but how to adjust, how to distribute effort, and how to remain engaged across changing conditions. As environments became more stable and patterns of life more structured, the formation of these habits began to change. Movement was still learned, but it was increasingly shaped by repeated tasks within familiar settings. Instead of adapting to constant variation, the body began to internalize patterns that were more predictable. These patterns could be efficient and effective for the tasks at hand, but they were often narrower in scope. Over generations, this influences how movement habits are passed on. Children learn what they see and repeat what is required. When daily life involves a limited range of movements, those movements become the foundation of physical development. Strength, in this context, becomes closely tied to the habits that are reinforced over time. This shift can also be understood through how the body responds to novelty. In environments where variation is common, the body remains practiced in adapting to new conditions. Movement is not only about repeating known actions, but about adjusting when those actions no longer apply. This keeps a wide range of physical responses active. In more stable environments, novelty may occur less frequently. The body becomes more accustomed to familiar patterns, and the need to adapt to unexpected conditions decreases. Over time, this can influence how strength is expressed. It remains present, but it is less frequently exercised across unfamiliar situations. Another aspect of this transition is how it affects the transmission of physical knowledge. In highly variable environments, knowledge of movement is often passed through observation and participation in diverse activities. The body learns through doing, across a wide range of conditions. In more structured environments, knowledge may become more task-specific. Skills are still learned, but they are tied to particular activities that are repeated regularly. This does not reduce their value, but it changes their scope. The body becomes highly skilled within certain contexts, while other forms of movement become less central. Archaeological and anthropological research supports the idea that as human societies became more stable in certain regions, patterns of activity became more specialized. This specialization is reflected not only in tools and settlements, but also in the ways bodies were used and developed. While we must be careful not to generalize too broadly, the overall trend suggests that movement habits became more focused over time, aligning with the demands of more predictable environments. This generational shaping of movement habits contributes to the broader transformation of strength. It is not only the result of immediate conditions, but of repeated patterns carried forward across time. When those patterns emphasize variation and continuous adaptation, strength tends to remain broadly distributed and flexible. When they emphasize repetition and specialization, strength becomes more concentrated and task-specific. The question of why humans lost strength after the Ice Age continues to deepen here. It is not only about the environment or the body in isolation, but about how patterns of life are transmitted from one generation to the next. As those patterns shifted toward greater stability and predictability, the habits that shaped the body shifted as well. Strength remained, but it followed the new patterns, becoming more closely aligned with specific tasks and less embedded in the full range of movement that once defined survival in a colder and more uncertain world. As these patterns of movement and habit continue across generations, one final layer begins to emerge, and it concerns not only what the body does, but what it comes to expect from the world around it. During the Ice Age, expectation was closely tied to uncertainty. The body could not assume that conditions would remain the same from one moment to the next. Movement had to remain flexible, readiness had to be maintained, and strength had to be available across a wide range of possible demands. Over time, this creates a body that is not only capable of varied movement, but also oriented toward it. The body expects change, and it organizes itself in a way that keeps many options open at once. As environments became more stable and patterns of life more predictable, those expectations began to shift. The body no longer needed to prepare for as many unknowns. It could rely more on what had been experienced before. This does not remove the ability to adapt, but it reduces the frequency with which adaptation is required. Over generations, this influences how the body prepares itself for action. Instead of maintaining a broad readiness, it begins to align more closely with expected tasks. Strength, in this context, becomes more closely tied to what is likely to happen rather than to what might happen. This change is subtle, but it has lasting effects. When the body expects variation, it maintains a wider range of engagement. When it expects repetition, it narrows its focus. Neither state is inherently better or worse, but they produce different forms of strength. One is flexible and widely distributed, supporting many possible actions. The other is efficient and concentrated, supporting specific tasks with greater precision. The shift from one to the other reflects a change in the relationship between the body and its environment. Archaeological evidence supports the idea that as human groups adapted to more stable conditions, their activities became more structured and predictable in certain contexts. This structure is visible in repeated use of space, consistent tool patterns, and organized forms of labor. These changes suggest that daily life was becoming more regular, with fewer unexpected variations. The body, adapting to this regularity, begins to reflect it in how strength is maintained. It no longer needs to remain equally prepared for all possibilities. Instead, it becomes more closely aligned with the patterns that occur most often. Another important aspect of this transition is how it affects recovery and effort over time. In uncertain environments, effort is often continuous, and recovery may be incomplete. The body learns to function within this ongoing state, maintaining strength through constant engagement. In more predictable environments, recovery can become more complete, and effort can be more clearly separated from rest. This allows the body to operate in cycles, where strength is built and used within defined periods. While this can support efficiency, it also changes how strength is sustained. It becomes less of a constant background condition and more of a capacity that rises and falls with activity. Over generations, these changes in expectation, habit, and structure accumulate. The body that once maintained strength as a continuous response to uncertainty begins to reorganize around a world where uncertainty is reduced. Strength remains, but it is no longer required to be present in the same way at all times. It becomes more selective, more focused, and more closely tied to the tasks that define daily life. This does not represent a sudden loss, but a gradual transformation. The Ice Age shaped a body that expected variation and maintained strength across many possibilities. The world that followed allowed for a body that could rely more on repetition, more on predictability, and more on defined patterns of effort. Within that transition, strength did not disappear, but it changed in how it was prepared, expressed, and sustained. The deeper question continues to unfold, not as a simple answer, but as a reflection on how the body carries the memory of its environment across generations, adapting quietly to a world that no longer asks it to remain ready for everything at once. If we look closely at the physical traces left behind in human remains, another layer of this long transition begins to appear, one that does not rely on interpretation of behavior alone, but on changes preserved in bone itself. Bones are not fixed structures. They respond over time to the forces placed upon them, becoming denser, thicker, or more robust in areas that are regularly loaded. This process is widely accepted in biology and provides a way to understand how patterns of movement can leave lasting marks across generations. During periods associated with more mobile lifeways, including much of the Ice Age, many skeletal remains show signs consistent with frequent and varied physical use. Long bones often display greater structural reinforcement, and joint surfaces can reflect repeated engagement across different types of movement. These features do not prove that every individual was stronger in a simple sense, but they suggest that the body was regularly exposed to loading that required broad and continuous engagement. As environments changed and patterns of life became more stable in certain regions, these skeletal patterns begin to shift. In some later populations, bones appear less robust overall, and the distribution of stress markers can become more localized. This does not indicate weakness in a direct or immediate sense, but it reflects a change in how the body was used over time. When movement becomes more repetitive and less varied, the forces acting on the skeleton also become more focused. The body adapts by reinforcing specific areas while reducing the need to maintain the same level of structural support across the entire system. This transition is not uniform across all regions or populations, and it unfolds gradually over long periods. Some groups remained highly mobile, maintaining patterns of activity that continued to place broad demands on the body. Others, particularly those moving toward more stable forms of living, show clearer signs of change in skeletal structure. The important point is not to draw a single line between strong and weak, but to recognize that the body reflects the conditions it experiences most often. When those conditions shift, the skeleton records that shift in subtle ways. One of the clearest patterns observed in anthropological research is the reduction in overall bone robustness in many populations over time, particularly as human societies move toward more sedentary and structured ways of living. This pattern is widely discussed in the field and is generally understood as a response to changes in activity levels and loading, rather than as a sudden biological decline. Bones become less dense or less thick, not because the body is failing, but because it no longer needs to support the same continuous and varied stresses. This aligns with the broader idea that strength, as expressed through the skeleton, is closely tied to habitual use. Another important aspect of skeletal evidence is how it reflects differences in activity between individuals and groups. Even within the same time period, variations in lifestyle can produce different patterns in bone structure. This reinforces the idea that strength is not a fixed trait shared equally across all humans, but a response to specific conditions. The Ice Age provided a set of conditions that often required sustained, varied movement. Later environments, in some regions, provided conditions that allowed for more localized and repetitive activity. The skeleton, adapting to these patterns, changes accordingly. It is also important to approach this evidence with care. Bones preserve only part of the story. They do not capture soft tissues, daily variations in effort, or the full complexity of human movement. However, they offer a consistent and widely accepted line of evidence that supports the broader narrative. Changes in bone structure over time reflect changes in how the body was used, and those changes align with shifts in environment, mobility, and daily life after the Ice Age. This brings the central question into sharper focus. If humans appear to have lost strength after the Ice Age, Part of that perception may come from these visible changes in skeletal robustness. But what those changes actually represent is not a simple loss, but an adaptation. The body no longer needed to maintain the same level of structural reinforcement because it was no longer exposed to the same continuous demands. Strength, as recorded in bone, becomes less about constant full-body loading and more about specific, repeated patterns of use. Over time, this creates a different physical signature, one that reflects a world where the body is still capable, still responsive, but no longer shaped by the same persistent pressures that once defined life in colder and more variable environments. The skeleton does more than preserve shape. It preserves memory, not in the sense of thought, but in the quieter sense of repeated use. Over long periods, bone responds to pressure, to load, to the pull of muscles, and to the rhythm of movement that life imposes again and again. This is one reason skeletal evidence matters so much in a question like this. It allows us to look beyond imagination and into something more grounded. We cannot watch Ice Age bodies move, but we can examine the traces left by the ways those bodies were used. And those traces suggest that earlier human populations often lived with forms of loading that were broad, repeated, and physically demanding in ways that touched much of the body at once. In many prehistoric remains associated with mobile lifeways, researchers have observed stronger structural reinforcement in the long bones, especially in the lower limbs, and patterns that are consistent with regular movement across space. This does not mean every person was equally strong, and it does not justify romantic claims about a lost age of superhuman bodies, but it does support a simpler and more careful point. The body was often being asked to carry itself, and sometimes much more than itself, through landscapes that required frequent and repeated effort. Bone, responding to that reality, became more robust where it needed to. As later populations in some regions moved into more stable and often less mobile patterns of life, the skeleton began to change in ways that anthropologists have discussed for many years. In broad terms, bones in many later populations often show reduced robustness compared with earlier groups. The lower limbs in particular can reflect this shift, which makes sense when we remember how closely those bones respond to habitual walking, carrying, and movement across varied ground. When daily life includes less continuous movement over distance, the body does not maintain the same structural reinforcement. This is not failure, it is adaptation. Bone is economical. It does not remain heavier or stronger than needed without reason. That economy is one of the quiet themes running through this entire story. The body keeps what life asks for often enough. When life changes, the body changes with it. Another important part of skeletal evidence lies in asymmetry and localized stress. In some later populations, researchers find patterns that suggest repeated, specialized activity affecting certain regions more than others. This can appear in the upper limbs, joints, or attachment sites where muscles repeatedly pulled against bone in familiar ways. These traces matter because they suggest a world in which daily effort had become more focused. Rather than broadly distributed movement across changing landscapes, some forms of work began to leave clearer signatures in particular parts of the body. That shift does not mean the body was doing less. It means it was doing different things more often, and that difference helps explain how strength may have changed after the Ice Age. The body did not simply become weaker. It became more shaped by repeated task patterns, and less by constant whole-body variation. Bone also reminds us that this transition was uneven. Not all human groups changed in the same way or at the same time. Some populations remained highly mobile for long periods, and their skeletons often preserve signs consistent with continued broad physical loading. Others, especially in environments that allowed greater stability, show clearer evidence of reduced mobility or more specialized activity. This variation is important because it protects us from oversimplification. There was no single human body after the Ice Age. There were many bodies, each responding to different environments, food systems, and ways of living. Still, the larger pattern remains meaningful. Where movement narrowed, the skeleton often narrowed with it in the way it distributed reinforcement. Where life became more repetitive, bone often recorded that repetition. This is one of the strongest grounded clues we have. It does not tell us everything, but it points in the same direction as the rest of the evidence. The world after the Ice Age gradually allowed many human bodies to live under different physical conditions than before. Those conditions no longer demanded the same constant, varied, full-body loading, so the skeleton stopped preparing for it in the same way. In that sense, what appears as lost strength may partly be the visible record of a body that no longer needed to carry the same structural memory of movement. The bones still held the story. They were simply beginning to tell a different one. What the skeleton finally reveals, if we stay with it long enough, is not only that human bodies changed after the Ice Age, but that they changed in a very particular direction. Earlier remains often suggest bodies that were shaped by movement spread across distance, uneven ground, and varied tasks. Later remains, in many contexts, begin to show something quieter. The body is still active, still working, still carrying the marks of labour, but the pattern becomes narrower. Instead of a broadly reinforced frame prepared for many kinds of demand, we more often begin to see evidence of repeated stress in more specific areas. This matters because it helps answer the title's question without forcing it into a simple story of decline. If humans lost strength after the Ice Age, the skeleton suggests that what changed first was not the body's ability to work, but the distribution of the work itself. Bone responds to load where load is applied. It thickens, strengthens, and reorganizes where force returns again and again. When that force is spread widely through walking, carrying, climbing, balancing, and constant adaptation, the skeleton tends to reflect broader reinforcement. When force becomes more repetitive and more localized, the skeleton begins to reflect that as well. This is one reason later human remains can preserve signs of hard labor and still appear less broadly robust than earlier ones. The body has not stopped working. It is simply working in a different pattern. That distinction is important because it protects us from a false contrast between ancient strength and later weakness. The deeper contrast is between variation and repetition, between wide bodily loading and narrower, task-driven loading. In many post-Ice Age settings, especially where life became more stable and movement more contained, the skeleton records this transition. The lower limbs may no longer carry the same signs of constant distance and varied terrain. Certain joints or muscle attachment sites may instead show repeated use linked to familiar tasks. The body remains shaped by labor, but it is no longer being shaped by the same full-body conversation with landscape that had marked so much of earlier human life. This also helps explain why skeletal evidence feels so grounded. It does not depend on imagining what ancient people thought or intended. It depends on ordinary biological response. Bone is constantly remodeling in relation to habitual use. That principle is widely accepted, and it gives us a stable way to think about change over time. When anthropologists observe reduced overall robustness in many later populations, especially alongside evidence for more structured and localized activity, the pattern fits a broader shift in daily life. The world after the Ice Age often placed different demands on the body, and the skeleton adjusted accordingly. Another quiet point emerges here. Bone does not preserve every form of strength equally. It records long-term patterns better than short-lived effort. That means what we see in the archaeological record is not a series of dramatic feats, but the ordinary structure of life repeated across years. And what that structure seems to show, in many cases, is a movement away from constant, varied, whole-body demand toward more focused and familiar forms of labor. This is exactly the kind of transition that could make later humans seem less strong in a broad physical sense, even while they remained fully capable within the tasks their world required. The Ice Age had supported bodies that often had to remain ready for many kinds of movement at once. The world that followed, in many regions, increasingly allowed bodies to become efficient within narrower ranges of effort. So the skeleton becomes a witness not to sudden loss but to long adaptation. It remembers when the body had to carry strength everywhere, and it remembers when that strength could begin to settle into more specific places. If we listen carefully to that record, the answer becomes calmer and more precise. Humans did not simply become weak after the Ice Age. Many human bodies gradually stopped needing the same broad structural reinforcement that colder, harsher, and less predictable environments had once demanded. And when the need changed, the skeleton changed with it, preserving in silence the long shift from a body shaped by constant full-body negotiation with the world to a body increasingly organized around repeated, familiar, and more contained forms of effort. As the long transition away from Ice Age conditions continued, another layer of change began to shape how strength functioned in daily life, and it becomes clearer when we consider what strength was actually needed for. During earlier periods, strength was closely tied to survival in a direct and immediate way. Movement, carrying, balance, and endurance were not optional skills. They were part of staying alive in environments that offered little separation between effort and outcome. When those conditions began to ease in certain regions, strength did not disappear, but its role began to shift. It was no longer required at the same constant level for basic survival in every moment. This change is subtle, but it alters how the body maintains its abilities over time. In more stable environments, strength becomes less of a constant requirement and more of a situational tool. It is still needed for work, for building, for carrying, and for responding to challenges, but it does not need to be present in the same continuous way throughout the entire day. The body begins to operate with a different baseline. Instead of maintaining strength as a steady background condition, it allows strength to rise and fall depending on the demands placed upon it. This shift introduces a new pattern, where periods of lower physical engagement can exist without immediate consequence. Over generations, this pattern becomes part of how the body organizes itself. One of the key differences between these two conditions lies in how effort is triggered. In Ice Age environments, effort was often continuous, shaped by the need to respond to changing conditions without delay. In more stable environments, effort becomes more event-based. A task begins, is completed, and then ends, followed by a period of rest. This creates clearer boundaries between activity and inactivity. While this can support recovery, it also reduces the constant reinforcement that once sustained strength as a continuous condition. The body adapts to these boundaries, maintaining its capacity but no longer holding it in the same uninterrupted way. This change is also reflected in how people interact with their surroundings. When the environment requires constant negotiation, the body remains engaged even during simple actions. Walking, standing, and adjusting posture all contribute to maintaining strength. In more controlled or familiar environments, many of these small demands are reduced. Surfaces are more predictable, tasks are more structured, and the need for constant adjustment decreases. This does not eliminate physical effort, but it reduces the number of moments in which the body must engage fully. Over time, this influences how strength is maintained across the entire system. Archaeological and anthropological evidence supports the idea that as human societies became more organized and stable in certain regions, daily life began to include clearer distinctions between different types of activity. Work, rest, and movement became more structured, and the body adapted to these patterns. This does not mean that people became inactive or that physical labor disappeared. It means that the distribution of effort changed. Strength remained necessary, but it was no longer woven into every moment in the same way. Another important aspect of this transition is how it affects perception. When strength is required constantly, it becomes part of the background of life. It is not something that stands out, because it is always present. When strength becomes more situational, it becomes more noticeable when it is needed. This can create the impression that strength has diminished, when in fact, it has simply become less continuous. The body still retains the ability to perform demanding tasks, but it does not maintain that state at all times. This shift in perception may contribute to the broader idea that humans have lost strength over time. The question of why humans lost strength after the Ice Age continues to unfold through these changes. It is not only about physical capacity, but about how often that capacity is required and how it is integrated into daily life. When strength is no longer necessary at every moment, the body reorganizes around that reality. It maintains what is used, but it no longer sustains everything at once. Over generations, this leads to a body that is still capable, still adaptable, but structured differently. Shaped by a world where survival no longer depends on constant physical engagement, and where strength becomes a response to specific needs rather than a continuous condition carried throughout the entire day. As strength became less woven into every moment of survival, another change followed, one that shaped not only the body, but the meaning of physical effort itself. During the Ice Age, effort was often inseparable from ordinary existence. To move was to search, to carry, to endure exposure, to remain ready for uneven ground, uncertain resources, and the simple fact that survival could not be separated from the demands of the landscape. In that kind of world, strength was not something that stood apart from life. It was absorbed into the background, present in the way the body walked, lifted, balanced, and continued. But when conditions grew more stable and the immediate pressures of the environment eased in many regions, strength began to shift from background condition to visible task. It was still needed, but more often for specific moments rather than for the continuous maintenance of life itself. This distinction changes how the body is organized. A body that must stay physically engaged across most of the day will distribute effort differently from a body that can remain at lower levels of engagement until a task demands more. The first maintains a kind of low, steady readiness. The second allows physical capacity to gather and release in clearer intervals. Over time, this does not simply alter muscle use, it changes the entire rhythm of effort. Strength becomes less constant and more event-like. It appears when lifting, building, carrying, or working intensely, then recedes more fully when the task ends. This pattern is widely compatible with what we know about how bodies adapt to repeated use. The body strengthens what is used frequently and allows other capacities to remain less active when they are not constantly required. In more stable post-Ice Age settings, many tasks could still be physically demanding, but they were often more bounded. A person could begin a task, complete it, and then stop. That boundary matters. During earlier mobile lifeways, the line between task and non-task could be much less clear. Walking, scanning the ground, adjusting balance, responding to weather, and carrying what was needed all blended together into a continuous stream of action. Later, as environments became more familiar and daily activities more structured, effort could be contained within clearer spaces and clearer times. This made strength more noticeable because it was no longer spread so evenly across the whole day. It became associated with particular kinds of labor rather than with the entire act of living in the world. Another important effect of this change lies in what the body no longer has to maintain between tasks. In harsher and less predictable environments, the body benefits from staying partially engaged because the next demand may come quickly and without warning. In more predictable settings, that constant partial engagement becomes less necessary. The body can let go more completely. It can return more fully to stillness. This is not a flaw. It is a form of efficiency. But it also means that strength is no longer held in reserve in the same quiet, continuous way. Instead, it becomes something more selective, supported by the tasks that happen often enough to keep it active. Anthropological evidence supports this broader logic even when the details vary from group to group. As human life became more organized around repeated tasks, familiar environments, and clearer divisions between activity and rest, the body adapted to those new conditions. This did not produce a universal decline. It produced a change in pattern. Strength remained necessary, but it was no longer the same kind of necessity. It became tied more directly to labor events, repeated tasks, and specific roles rather than to the uninterrupted physical conversation between body and environment that had characterized much of earlier human life. This helps explain why later humans could still work hard, build, carry, and endure, yet still appear to have lost something compared with bodies shaped under broader and more constant demands. What changed was not simply the amount of effort, but the continuity of effort. And continuity matters because it determines whether strength is maintained as a background state or only called forward at certain moments. The Ice Age had supported a body that often had to remain physically available all day, even when no dramatic action was taking place. The world that followed increasingly allowed a body that could wait, conserve, and engage more selectively. Within that transition, strength did not vanish, but it became less like climate and more like weather, less like a constant condition of being alive and more like a capacity that arrives when a task calls for it, then slowly withdraws again when the world no longer asks the same question every hour. As strength became something used more selectively rather than carried continuously in the background of life, the body entered a quieter relationship with the world around it. During much of the Ice Age, the environment itself kept asking for physical readiness. Cold, distance, unstable ground, and uncertain timing did not always demand dramatic effort, but they rarely allowed the body to drift too far from action. Even ordinary moments contained low levels of adjustment. Standing was not quite passive. Walking was not simply travel. Carrying was not an isolated act. The body remained involved because the world remained physically present in every movement. After the Ice Age, as many environments became more stable and more familiar, this constant dialogue began to soften. The body could still work hard, but it no longer had to remain equally engaged between one demand and the next. This is one of the deepest ways strength may have changed. It was not only used differently, it was no longer required to stay close to the surface all the time. That change affects how the body prepares for action. In a world of constant low-level demand, preparation and effort are closely linked. The body does not fully separate the two. Muscles, posture, balance, and coordination remain lightly engaged even when no major task is underway. In a more stable world, preparation can be delayed. The body can remain at a lower level of engagement until a task clearly begins. This creates a sharper distinction between ordinary stillness and physical work. Over time, that distinction changes how strength is maintained. It is no longer reinforced through countless small acts of readiness spread across the day. Instead, it is reinforced mainly during the periods when effort becomes necessary enough to call it forward. The body adapts to this pattern by becoming more efficient. It stops maintaining what is not being asked for constantly. This is not decline in a simple sense. It is a redistribution of energy and attention. Another important difference appears in recovery. In earlier conditions, recovery was often incomplete because the body remained close to movement even during quieter periods. It might pause, but it did not always fully disengage. In more stable conditions, recovery can become deeper and more complete because the body is allowed clearer intervals of non-use. This can be beneficial in many ways, but it also means that strength is no longer held in the same continuous state between efforts. It must rise again when needed, rather than remaining quietly present as part of the body's ongoing posture toward the world. Over generations, this alters the baseline from which humans move. The body remains capable, but it becomes more cyclical in how it uses force, more dependent on distinct moments of activation, and less shaped by the uninterrupted demands that once linked movement so tightly to survival. Archaeological and anthropological evidence supports the broader pattern behind this idea. As human life in many regions became more structured, with more repeated tasks, more familiar spaces, and clearer separations between work and rest, the body would have adapted accordingly. We do not need to claim a universal decline or imagine that all later humans became physically fragile. That would go beyond what accepted evidence allows. A more careful conclusion is enough. When the world stopped demanding continuous whole-body engagement in the same way, the body stopped maintaining strength as a continuous condition in the same way. That shift helps explain why later human life could still involve hard labor and yet produce bodies that seem less broadly reinforced than those shaped by colder and more variable conditions. The labor remained, but the rhythm changed. The demands remained, but they became more bounded. The body still answered them, but not from the same constant state of readiness. This brings the title's question closer to its deepest meaning. Humans may not have lost strength after the Ice Age as though something inside the species simply broke. What many human bodies gradually lost was the need to keep strength present in every ordinary hour, and once that need faded, strength itself changed its place in the body. It became more intermittent, more task-bound, and more dependent on being called into action rather than being sustained by the shape of the world all day long. What disappeared first was not force, but the quiet environmental demand that had once kept force woven into the background of life itself. By the time we reach the final stage of this long transition, the question begins to change its shape. It becomes less useful to ask whether humans simply became weaker after the Ice Age, because that phrasing suggests that strength was once a permanent possession and then somehow faded away. The deeper pattern is quieter than that. Strength was never an object the body owned once and for all. It was a response maintained by repeated necessity, reinforced by movement, cold, distance, uncertainty, and the simple fact that survival demanded the body remain physically available almost all the time. When those conditions changed, the response changed with them. What seems at first like a loss of strength begins to look more like the loss of a world that had once required strength to stay close to the surface of daily life. This distinction matters because it protects us from a false story. It is easy to imagine that ancient humans possessed something superior that modern humans carelessly let slip away, but the evidence does not require that conclusion. Human bodies are still remarkably adaptable. They still respond to load, to practice, to repeated movement, and to environmental pressure. Bones still remodel, muscles still strengthen, coordination still expands with use. What changed after the Ice Age was not the body's basic ability to become strong, but the number of ordinary hours in which strength had to be quietly maintained just to meet the world. In colder and more unstable environments, the body could not drift very far from readiness. In more stable and predictable environments it could. That freedom is important. It allowed for new forms of living, new patterns of time, new relationships to place, and eventually new kinds of human society. But it also meant that strength no longer needed to exist as a constant background condition. It could become selective. It could become local. It could appear when called and recede when not. Over generations, that change becomes visible in movement patterns, in daily labor, in the organization of life, and even in the skeleton itself. The body is still following the same biological rule it always has. It sustains what is required often enough. It reduces what is not. In this sense, the title points towards something more subtle than decline. Humans may have lost strength after the Ice Age only in the sense that many bodies gradually lost the need to carry it everywhere, all the time. What faded was not the capacity itself, but the constant environmental demand that once kept that capacity active across the entire body. This also helps explain why modern people can still build extraordinary strength under the right conditions, while often feeling physically diminished in ordinary life. The body has not forgotten how to adapt. It has simply been placed inside a world that asks different things of it most of the time. Much of the day no longer requires walking across uncertain ground, preserving warmth through motion, carrying weight across distance, or staying ready for change in every hour. The body responds honestly to that reality. It becomes efficient within the demands it actually meets. That honesty may be the most important thing to notice. The body is not betraying its past. It is continuing the same long relationship with environment that shaped it from the beginning. The end of the Ice Age did not break that relationship. It transformed it. And once the world became less physically demanding in broad and continuous ways, strength itself began to change from a condition of existence into a capacity that depends more directly on use. This leaves us with a calmer conclusion than the title first suggests. Humans did not become weak because something essential was taken away from the species. Many human bodies simply entered a world where survival could be organized with less constant whole-body demand. Strength remained possible, but it no longer had to remain present in the same uninterrupted way. So perhaps what was lost after the Ice Age was not strength itself, but the pressure that once kept strength woven into ordinary life so completely that it hardly needed to be noticed at all. If that is true, then the final meaning of this story is not really about the past alone. It is also about how the human body still carries the logic of that older world, even while living under different conditions. The body we have now is not a new body made for comfort from the beginning. It is the same deeply responsive body that once moved through colder landscapes, adjusted to uncertainty, and sustained physical readiness because life required it. What changed was the structure of demand around it. That is why the question of lost strength can feel so personal in the present. Many people sense that their bodies are capable of more than daily life seems to ask of them, yet they also feel how quickly unused capacity grows quiet. This is not a contradiction. It is the same pattern repeated again. The body preserves what is used often enough, and it lets other capacities soften when the world no longer calls for them continuously. In this sense, the legacy of the Ice Age has not disappeared. It survives as a kind of biological honesty. Human bodies still respond to challenge, to load, to repetition, to terrain, to posture, and to movement spread across time. They still grow stronger when conditions require repeated engagement, but they no longer do so automatically in ordinary life, because ordinary life in many places is no longer built around the same broad and constant pressures. This does not make the modern body defective. It makes it faithful to its environment, just as earlier bodies were faithful to theirs. That may be the most grounded way to understand the change. After the Ice Age, Many human environments gradually stopped demanding constant whole-body negotiation with cold, distance, and uncertainty. In response, the body gradually stopped maintaining strength as a continuous background state. That is not failure. It is adaptation working exactly as it always has. This perspective also protects us from another kind of misunderstanding: the idea that returning to the past would somehow restore a more authentic human form. The past was not a training plan. It was a demanding set of conditions that shaped bodies through necessity, often at real cost. Cold, uncertainty, incomplete recovery, and constant physical demand did not create strength without burden. They created a kind of strength because survival left little room for anything else. To recognize that is important, because it keeps the story honest. The body did not lose something precious through carelessness. It followed a changing world into new forms of life. Some of those changes reduced broad physical demand. Some allowed deeper rest, greater stability, and more control over effort. Those are not trivial gains. They are part of human history too. So the answer cannot simply be that humans became weaker and left it there. A more careful answer is that many human bodies became less broadly reinforced because the world around them became less broadly demanding. The change is real, but it is structural rather than dramatic. It lives in patterns of movement, in the timing of effort, in bone, in posture, in habit, in childhood development, and in the slow way generations adapt to what everyday life repeatedly requires. And this is where the question becomes quietly educational. If strength is not a permanent possession, then it is also not a permanent disappearance. The body remains changeable. It still responds to repeated demand. It still reorganizes around what is done often. That truth should not be turned into simplistic advice or romantic myth, but it does offer a calm insight into human nature. We are not looking at a species that lost its strength once and for all. We are looking at a species whose body has always answered the world it lives in. During the Ice Age, that answer often took the form of broad, continuous physical readiness. After the Ice Age, in many places, the answer slowly became more selective, more localized, and more dependent on specific tasks. The body did not stop being human. It continued being human in a different environment. So perhaps the deepest lesson is not that strength vanished, but that the human body is always in conversation with the conditions around it, and what seems like loss is often the quieter shape of adaptation itself, still unfolding, still responsive, and still asking what kind of world is strong enough to call strength out of us every day. By the end of this long story, the title begins to sound less like a claim, and more like a careful translation of what the body has been doing all along. Humans did not move from strength to weakness in one clean line after the Ice Age. What changed was the world that had once required strength to remain present almost constantly. Cold withdrew in many regions. Landscapes became more predictable. Food in some places became easier to anticipate. Movement narrowed, tasks repeated, space became more familiar, and daily life slowly gained more structure. None of these changes erased hardship, but together they reduced the need for the body to maintain broad, continuous, whole-body readiness as an ordinary condition of existence. And because the body is not a symbol or an ideal, but a living system that responds honestly to repeated demand, it adapted. It kept what the environment asked for often enough, and it loosened what the environment no longer required in the same way. That is why the deepest answer to this question is not really about loss alone. It is about relationship. The human body has always been in relationship with climate, distance, terrain, uncertainty, work, rest, and time. During the Ice Age, that relationship often produced a form of strength that was widely distributed, constantly refreshed by movement, and woven into ordinary life so completely that it may not even have felt like strength in the modern sense. It was simply the body staying available to the world. After the Ice Age, as the world changed, the body changed too. Strength became more selective, more task-bound, more local, and more dependent on what daily life repeatedly required. This does not make later humans lesser, and it does not make earlier humans mythical. It reminds us that biology is not fixed performance. It is adaptation under pressure. That may be the most useful and honest lesson hidden inside the title. The body is not failing when it stops maintaining capacities that are no longer regularly demanded. It is conserving, reorganizing, and following the logic of survival in a new setting. At the same time, the body has not forgotten its older possibilities. Bones still respond to load, muscles still grow when used, coordination still deepens when movement becomes varied and repeated. Endurance still changes when life asks for more of it. The ancient pattern is not gone. It is simply quieter in a world that often asks different questions. This is where the story becomes educational in the most grounded sense. It suggests that human beings are neither trapped by the past nor separated from it. We carry a body shaped by long prehistory, but we live inside present conditions that guide what that body becomes from day to day and generation to generation. The real value of remembering the Ice Age is not to romanticize hardship or imagine a lost perfection. It is to understand that many things we call natural in the body were once responses to specific environments, and when those environments changed, the body responded with equal honesty. Seen this way, the history of human strength becomes a history of attention. What the world asks often, the body answers. What the world stops asking, the body stops holding so near the surface. That quiet principle reaches far beyond the Ice Age. It helps explain why physical capacities rise, fade, specialize, or return. It also offers a calmer way to think about ourselves. We are not looking at a species that simply declined. We are looking at a species that kept adapting, even when adaptation no longer looked like constant strength. So perhaps the final truth is gentle rather than dramatic. Humans may have lost strength after the Ice Age, only in the sense that many of us gradually lost the kind of world that once demanded strength every ordinary day. And if the body has always been listening so closely to the conditions around it, then the final question is not only what the Ice Age took away, but what any environment quietly teaches a human body to become before that body even notices the lesson.